What's up, meta nerds? This complete breakdown of the Hutt species will pull from every resource available, spanning decades of expanded universe material, which has really fleshed out the very fleshy Hutt species, one of the most interesting species in the galaxy far, far away. So we'll start right at the beginning by understanding their homeworld, but Nal Hutt is actually their adopted homeworld, the Huttese world for Glorious Jewel, a planet ironically famous for its swamps and pollution rather than any pristine sparkle to it. It's found deep in Hutt Space's Yatub system, and Nal Hutt was not originally the Hutt's native planet. Ancient lore holds that the Hutts came from the world of Varl, and resettled on Nal Hutt around 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The indigenous Avaki people were displaced by the arriving Hutts, and once a lush jungle realm with vast oceans, Nal Hutt was gradually transformed into a barren, swampy wasteland under centuries of Hutt industrial expansion. Today, its landscape is dominated by flat, marshy bogs, sickly yellow-green wetlands, and boggy plains broken up by occasional Hutt palaces and pleasure gardens. The planet's few surviving native creatures adapted to the new toxic ecosystem, like the chemalizard, an ooze-dwelling reptile, which can metabolize nutrients from industrial waste. The atmosphere is hot and dense, and the skies are often choked with greasy, acidic rain from constant strip mining and factory pollution. Humidity is high, turning the air into a fetid sauna, which is actually where the Hutts are most comfortable. Stagnant, polluted ponds and misty yellow clouds are common sights, and the raw materials that are continually mined here are ferried to its moon, Nar Shaddaa, the infamous smuggler's moon, which is actually where most of the Hutt economy is based. Despite, or perhaps because of, the ecological ruin, the Hutts regard Nal Hutt with pride. The glow of this glorious jewel most see as a perfect metaphor for their existence. What they find glorious, most species find repulsive, as this green gem is actually a glowing radioactive nebula, a testament to how they ruined the rich nature here. Because just about every galactic visitor here describes it as assaulting the senses. The air tastes of sulfur and spice, swarms of insects buzz in the marshes, and opulent Hutt palaces rise out of the muck. But to them, again, this is not a bug, this is a feature. They didn't want a lot of off-worlders visiting. It was perfectly crafted to their needs, and was so repulsive that they believed that it shielded them from the prying Republic eyes. Anybody that did want to fight galactic corruption had to deal with just another layer of repulsiveness, feelings that they want to make a difference, threats to their lives from bounty hunters, and just how horrible it was to stay here for even just a few hours. But how did such a seemingly repulsive race of slug-like titans come to dominate an entire region of the galaxy, far longer than any Sith Lords? Xenobiologists speculate that the answers lie in Hutt evolutionary history, shaped by the unforgiving swamps of Nal Hutt, but also the mysterious trials of Varl before that. Though fossils are scarce and the Hutts themselves keep few records of their prehistory, there are several educated theories. What we can call the aquatic amphibious origins. Many Coruscanti biologists hypothesize that the Hutts evolved from aquatic or amphibious gastropod ancestors. Their massive slug-like bodies and muscular tail all support this idea, because that tail is not just for show. It contains a strong skeletal spine and powerful muscles that let the Hutt propel themselves through muck where legs would just sink into it. Where a humanoid would get hopelessly bogged down, the Hutt can swim or slither around with ease. This adaptation hints that early Hutts likely lived in a similar swampy lake and tidal marsh region, using undulating locomotion to navigate a world of mud instead of solid ground. The average Hutt's hide is thick, leathery, wrinkled, and slimy, and this is not a cosmetic quirk. This slimy, tough skin evolved as a protection. Nal Hutt's water and soil are laden with toxins, and so the Hutt's epidermis might have served as both an armor and filter. The slick mucus coating could trap harmful particles and bacteria. Even high-grade industrial chemical runoff does not bother them, while the leathery layer beneath prevents all abrasions. Some call this their natural slug sunscreen, because it's also believed to retain moisture, crucial for a being that might dehydrate in drier climates. This mucus coat means that they're always moist, whether they're in the swamps of Nal Hutt or making an appearance at a pod race on Tatooine. Their internal anatomy is also very unusual. One of the most famous features is that they have 3 lungs in their enormous barrel-like torso. This too is believed to help them on an oxygen-poor and noxious world where extra respiratory capacity ensured survival. Nal Hutt's swamp gas atmosphere can be low in clean oxygen and high in pollutants, so ancestral Hutts needed redundant lungs to extract enough air and filter out toxins. This has made it so that modern Hutts can survive encounters with mild poisons and don't seem to be winded even in foul air. These sort of backup lungs would also help large-bodied creatures recovered from injury, like if they did get a punctured lung, giving the Hutts a hard-to-kill quality that served them well as apex creatures. I'm not sure how much I agree with this theory, but I should bring it up, that it's believed that because their biology is so different, everything from their breathing rate to metabolism, because we are all mind-body creatures, maybe this is why Jedi mind tricks don't work so easily on them, since their sort of brain rhythm is so unlike all the other species that a Jedi might have practice with controlling. I think it's more about people or entire populations that have sort of cut themselves off from the Force due to repeated practices or just a culture that they were raised in, but this is heavily debated. Another more disturbing topic of heavy debate is the aspects of Hutt biology in regards to how they reproduce. Are Hutts male, female, or both? In ancient records and legends across the galaxy, all Hutts were described as hermaphroditic. Each individual carried both male and female reproductive organs and could reproduce asexually if needed, meaning without a partner. This reproductive flexibility might have been an evolutionary strategy during times when the Hutts were solitary and geographically scattered. If a lone Hutt couldn't find a mate, it could still produce offspring, ensuring the species' survival. One early xenobiological text says, quote, Hutts could reproduce by themselves or mate with another Hutt, as circumstances required. Some scholars theorize that this trait developed on dangerous Varl. If catastrophic events or predators, like the legendary Kefondo Kappa creatures that allegedly terrorized Varl, if these decimated the population, this pressure would have selected for a species that could self-fertilize in order to rebuild their numbers. But more recent sources have shifted the academic canon here, and the sort of working theory is that over millennia of civilization, Hutts started favoring one sex or the other for social and psychological reasons, even if long ago they did biologically have the capacity for both, since they haven't needed this feature, and they've been engaged in a galactic community for thousands of years in which sexual dimorphism is the norm. When it wasn't necessary, they became more identified with this male or female expression, and so they would stay in this fixed sex for their entire life. There's every reason to believe that it's still in their genome, and could re-emerge with the right pressures, i.e. if the Hutts were ever nearly extinct. Another famous trait is that they have extremely slow development. Called a Huttlet, is tiny, less than half a meter tall, and utterly helpless. To survive, the infant spends its first 50 years in the brood pouch of a parent. Essentially, adult Hutts act as living incubators, carrying their young in a specialized belly pouch and nursing them for decades. By the time a young Hutt finally emerges into the world, it's already the equivalent of a toddler, but still having the mind of an infant even at 50 years old. This suggests what's called a K-selected strategy, few offspring, and heavily invested parental care that makes sense for a long-lived species in a hazardous environment. On predator-filled Varl or Nal Hutt, a squishy baby slug wouldn't last long on its own, so keeping the young inside a robust adult's pouch until they gain some size, weight, and a little more intelligence, this can greatly increase survival rates. And they do have incredibly long lifespans, routinely living for centuries, and some have even reached around 1,000 years old. Jabba the Hutt was around 604 years old when he was killed by Princess Leia, and this might be the most important key to understanding how they became such a staple in the galaxy. Even though they take a long time on each of their young, they still have a lot of time to reproduce and pass on those genes, and all of them have an incredible time to accumulate wisdom, or just power, outliving almost every other species out there. They're outliving most governments, let alone some temporary, democratically elected leader. The average adult Hutt can weigh many tons and measure several meters long, and they're actually said to never really stop growing even after 600 years. That's part of what we're seeing with Zero's mom, Mama, although I'm sure there's some extra indulgence there as well. Their bodies are composed of a muscular hydrostatic system, which is thick layers of muscle and fat with high water content, making them extremely tough and resilient. Blows that might break the bones of a humanoid merely sink into the Hutt's blubber without causing serious harm. But their strength, especially in their tail and arms, if they could get you, is formidable. Hutts can constrict or crush creatures with a single heave of its body, and there's an old palace saying to never tickle a Hutt, as a reflexive twitch of the tail might flatten you, and that wrinkled, slimy skin also has some healing benefits, though at a genetic level they do have many disorders. And it's not fully understood why this is, maybe just being in constant conflict with a noxious environment, and their often horrid, self-indulgent lifestyles. Their eyes are often watery, with a large nostril-flanked snout, and broad, lipless mouth that's curled in this sort of frog-like grin. Their eyesight is adequate but not exceptional, and they rely more on their other senses. Their sense of smell and taste is highly developed, which was necessary for discerning fish prey from the endless expanses of rotten swamp sludge. They can detect chemical changes in the air, which likely evolved to sense toxins and approaching predators in the slime pools of their youth. And they have keen hearing. Those floppy-looking ear holes on their heads can discern a surprising range of frequencies. Combine that with their long life, this makes them excellent information brokers. The Hutts literally never miss a whisper in their court. And since their evolution made them incredibly sensitive with their smell, taste, and hearing, it's no surprise that once life became good, they may have overindulged in these senses, wanting every variety and quality of nice smells in the sense of perfumes and incense. They're always wanting to eat something and have the best and most unique bands from all over the galaxy perform for them. One of their famous delicacies was live Klatooine patty frogs, gorgs, and slime pods, which they would devour by the bowlfuls. And again, this evolved in a harsh world where food was scarce and they needed to store fat for long famine periods. But now those with enough credits can seem to endlessly gorge themselves. Combined with their never-ending growth rate and naturally slow metabolism, they just keep getting bigger and bigger. And there are some cultural holdovers from those old famine times, because they still see being large as being capable and well off. They're obviously able to provide for themselves. Family lineages are still tracked, and clan heredity is vital to Hutt politics. But they are not strictly patrilineal or matrilineal, as especially in older times, every Hutt could be both a mother or father to their future of their clan. By around 200 years old, a Hutt is considered an adult and has fully entered whatever business or power structure their clan occupies. From 200 to 600 years, they're in their prime. This is the age we see Jabba dominating Tatooine. Past 700 or 800 years, a Hutt enters a sort of elder status. They might become less active physically, but their cunning and expertise are unparalleled. A millennium-old Hutt is a repository of centuries of knowledge and grudges, and though many would be killed by clan warfare, if not, they just keep growing so big that they eventually die from organ failure. Some have seen a great irony in their species, that for all we know they might possess immortality, but are deprived of it because of their excessive lifestyle, and because so many of them are connected to crime. They either die from overeating, or through blaster fire. Even one of the most popular Hutt sayings is, Yaug ho tenya dawanki, a long life eats many blaster bolts. And so everything from their unique biology, being crafted in this intense crucible, to be tough and long-lived, nature made the Hutts to be survivors, and the galaxy has learned that whatever survives, rules. Their culture is as rich and layered as a bowl of gargroch stew, and just as foreign and repulsive to most outsiders. Some even think the term Hutt culture is a bit of an oxymoron, but they really do have a complex society stretching back millennia, with its own values, customs, and even high art. But we should start by understanding the Khajiitics, the Hutt clans. Hutt society is fundamentally organized around clan families called Khajiitics. The Khajiitic is more than just a bloodline, it's a family business and criminal syndicate all rolled into one. Each Khajiitic is essentially a powerful crime family controlling territories and enterprises. Jabba belonged to the Disilagic Khajiitic, which is one of the most infamous. Each has its own hierarchy and bosses, often led by a council of elders. They form the ruling elite of Hutt space and convene in bodies like the Grand Hutt Council, making decisions that affect all Hutts. Allegiance to one's Khajiitic is the paramount loyalty for any Hutt. Clan honor and prosperity come first. Hutts even tattoo their clan symbol on their bodies as a mark of pride. Jabba bore the Disilagic crest tattooed on his forearm, and rivalry between Khajiitics can be intense, often resulting in assassinations. But actually, open warfare has been rare since the formation of the Council of Elders. Basically, the Mob Dons keep everything as clean as possible. Because long ago, after nearly destroying themselves in clan wars, the Hutts agreed to settle disputes through diplomacy, either backroom deals or economic competition, rather than outright battles. This organized crime truce is believed to be one of the reasons that Hutt space remained stable for so long. Their native tongue is Huttese, a guttural language filled with elongated vowels and percussive consonants, and it's actually the second most prevalent language in the galaxy after Basic, and serves as the lingua franca in the Outer Rim and Underworld. Smugglers, bounty hunters, Twi'lek dancers, and even moisture farmers on Tatooine will often know enough Huttese to get by. Many call Huttese the mother tongue of criminals across the galaxy. This rose because of their extensive commercial networks. If you wanted to do business, whether legal or illegal, if it was happening in Hutt territory, you spoke Huttese. And over time, entire species adopted Huttese, like the Nikto, Klatunians, and Vodrins. They were all Hutt vassal species, and so the language of their rulers became their primary language after the ancient Treaty of Vontor bound them to Hutt service. And this influence is something that the Hutts want to protect. Even if they understand other languages, they will almost always speak in Huttese and prefer to have everything translated through a protocol droid. This is a form of linguistic domination, hoping that if everybody speaks your language, it subtly reinforces your status and shows that the Hutts are still central to galactic power.
All Hutts can speak your language. We simply choose not to. Given the circumstances, I prefer to avoid linguistic misunderstandings. We have complementary goals. You want what the Burrow possesses, and I wish very much not to die here.
In terms of their values, it's true that their society in general, it's true that their society values only power and wealth. Even the term morality doesn't have a direct translation. A Hutt doesn't see running a spice smuggling ring or a slave market as evil. It's simply business. Like some fish eating another, or vine strangling some plant, it's just what they do. They wouldn't be those things if they didn't act that way. Hutts simply are. Likewise, crime is not a real concept to them. It's all just different forms of resource gathering. What comes close to honor for a Hutt is not about being truthful or charity, but they do believe in keeping one's word, in the context of a deal being struck between peers, and of course protecting the others in your clan. They take contracts extremely seriously. Being weak, poor, or breaking a deal are the only real ways to earn scorn from your peers. They do admire cunning over brute force, preferring to win via clever schemes, though of course this can include some violence. In Hutt storytelling and proverbs often glorify the underhanded victory. A classic Hutt fable involves a small Hutt outsmarting a much larger one to claim a mudhole, a lesson that brains are better than brawn, even to this enormous species. And the stereotype of the luxury-loving Hutt is absolutely true. The closest thing to a moral good would be to build a lavish palace, adorned with imported marble, silks, gold, and priceless art, which is often stolen. And Hutt interior design favors terraced architecture with sloping archways, painted in bold whites and reds, a style visible in old Hutt buildings on Nal Hutt and its moon, Nar Shaddaa. And most Hutts don't wear any clothes. In general, ornamentation doesn't really extend to their bodies. Some will drape themselves in jewelry, or even use live creatures as accessories. Some wore Shirelian tube creatures as living hairpieces or headdresses that would squirm on top of their heads, an effect that was unsettling to outsiders, but to Hutts it was just this unique, whimsical display of wealth. Food and entertainment are central to Hutt daily life. Hutt court is usually filled with the aromas of exotic meats, the pop of small creatures being snacked on, and the sound of live music like Max Rebo's band playing Jizz Whales, serenading Jabbas court. And they also love to boast. They might invite rivals and allies to an extravagant meal to show off all their resources, and maybe even poison someone. Hutts smoke potent narcotics and sweet spices through their hookah pipes. When it comes to their family life, it's not uncommon for a clan to collectively raise the young. Those brood pouch-bound Huttlets might rotate between elder relatives' pouches, and because so many were killed off in clan warfare, there was a lot of adoption going on within the clan. Each Khajiitic often has one patriarch or matriarch, and if they're really large, they might even have a whole council, and they were in charge of allocating territories and duties to each family member. One Hutt cousin might oversee smuggling operations on Nar Shaddaa, while another handles finances on Coruscant via intermediaries, all funneling credits back to the clan coffers. Siblings often sabotage each other in order to climb the hierarchy, but almost always an external threat will get them all to work together. They have a saying, "I can insult my brother, but if you insult my brother, you insult me." And as for their religions and traditions, the closest thing they seem to have to gods are their own ancestors. It's one Hutt in particular that stands out, Bunta Hastillik Shadru, an ancient hero of the Hutts. Bunta's military victories, which we'll look at in a bit, were so famous that legends say he ascended to godhood. Bunta is honored with a grand festival called Bunta Eve, and this is celebrated every year. On Bunta Eve, the Hutts commemorate their ancient triumphs with gladiator games, pod races, and feats, and the most famous is the Bunta Eve Classic pod race on Tatooine. They believe that this ancestor had become so powerful that he became a god, And so while other species worried about conflicting morality claims, to them, power was the only thing that mattered. And if you got enough of it, you would be even more powerful than death. So while they don't really have a pantheon of gods, their spirituality, as much as it is, does seem to have a concept of destiny and fortune. They'll casually invoke luck spirits or ancestors watching over deals, and they can evoke Bunta, saying things like, "Bunta smiles on our bargain," seeing it as this ancestor still working on their behalf. And not all Hutts are solely obsessed with crime. Given their long lives, many develop eccentric hobbies. There are recorded instances of Hutt art collectors, scholars, and even filmmakers. Obi-Wan remembered a Hutt that was an avid collector of fine porcelain antiques, showing that at least a few slugs appreciate art for art's sake. And while their own art tends to be grandiose and gaudy, murals depicting Hutt victories, statues of famous Hutts, and the like, there were of course exceptions, but it is pretty absurd how rare these exceptions were. The majority just enjoyed food, watching violent battles, gambling on sabacc tournaments rigged in their favor, betting on rancor fights, or simply hitting the spice and watching Twi'lek dancers. In terms of any sort of internal law enforcement, they have an eye for an eye code enforced by the Hutts themselves. There is no independent judiciary in Hutt space. The Khajiitic leaders are the law. If someone steals from a Hutt, that Hutt or their clan enforcers will deal out the punishment, often cruelly and creatively, and loyalty is rewarded lavishly, while betrayal is punished lethally. Hutts often negotiate restitution instead of going straight to violence. They'll demand payment or favors equivalent to insult or loss, but if payment isn't made, a very public and deadly lesson will follow. This serves to maintain order through fear, and the concept of Hutt cartel law basically boils down to don't cross the Hutts or else. But within their clans, they do have elaborate protocols for resolving disputes. They don't really want to kill a useful family member unless it's absolutely necessary, and they hold clan meetings called Ekmea, where grievances are aired and arbitrated by elders. The Council of Elders on Nar Shaddaa serves as a supreme court of sorts in their inter-clan issues. Their decisions, once made, are binding and backed by all Khajiitics, in order to avoid destructive feuds and endless cycles of retributive violence. When a Hutt does eventually die, they do have rituals. It was customary for Hutts to bandage their dead and bury them in sepulchres on Nal Hutt. A deceased Hutt's body is wrapped in oils and cloth, perhaps a nod to the mucus that preserved them in life, and they were laid to rest in a vault often filled with some of their favorite treasures. Some clans even believe that the essence of a powerful Hutt might manifest as a ghost. There are some spooky tales shared throughout the galaxy of Hutts that were still trying to protect their treasure. And these sites had to be protected by their family, because there was a deep fear amongst them that rival Hutt clans would send grave robbers to steal the body so that it could be skinned and the hide turned into a trophy, put on display in some rival Hutt's palace. And so their entire culture revolves around profit, family, and power, where a holiday celebration might involve feeding prisoners to beasts for entertainment, while affectionately cradling a tiny Huttlet in their brood pouch. And now we get to their history, which is a recorded history for tens of thousands of years, filled with rise, fall, and resurgence. Few species can claim to have shaped galactic history to the extent the Hutts have, especially without ever formally joining the Galactic Republic or any of the Sith empires. So let's start from the beginning. According to Hutt legends, their species originated on the distant planet Varl. Little is known about Varl, and it's still shrouded in myth, but at the core there is this tale of a paradise that turns into hell. One legend recounts that Varl was once illuminated by two suns, until one destroyed the other in a cosmic catastrophe, plunging Varl into chaos, the so-called Hutt cataclysms. Another tale, more recently corroborated by historians, tells of the Kefondo Kappa, deadly, hungry hands, these horrifying creatures that preyed on the Hutts in the Varl system. Whether by astrophysical disaster, or monstrous predators, or some combination of both, the Hutts faced extinction on Varl. Around 15,000 BBY, they made a momentous decision to abandon their homeworld, and leading their slave servants, including a species called the Talunda Till, and carrying whatever wealth they had with them, the Hutts embarked on a migratory journey. They arrived on the lush world of Evokar, in the Yatub system, home of the Avaki, and through a mix of trickery, trade, and just brute force, they took the planet for themselves. Evokar was renamed Nal Hutt, or Glorious Jewel, and this would forever remain as their homeworld. The displaced native Avaki tragically were relocated to Nal Hutt's moon, Nar Shaddaa, where they fell into deep poverty under Hutt rule, making them a grim footnote typical of Hutt expansion. With Nal Hutt as their capital, the Hutts established what would come to be known as the Hutt Empire. a vast dominion that predated the Galactic Republic. Millennia ago, Hutts were not seen as slimy crime bosses, but as warlords and economic overlords. They colonized many worlds in the Outer Rim, and exerted control primarily through mercantile influence and slave armies. One elder Hutt, Sajin, boasted, quote, "Millennia ago, we were idolized by the younger species. We brought a golden age to 1,000,000 worlds." And while certainly hyperbolic, it is true that the Hutt Empire was a major power. Unlike later eras, the ancient Hutts did engage in conquest when it suited them. They would enslave useful species and exterminate those who resisted. Many planets in what is now Hutt space have legends of a time when defying a Hutt could result in your entire city being leveled from orbit. The Hutt's biggest test came against one of the galaxy's earliest tyrants. Zim was a human warlord who built his own empire in the nearby Tion cluster around 25,130 BBY. Eventually, Zim's expansionist eye fell on Hutt territories, and a titanic war ensued, known in history as the Zim Wars. The war lasted years and featured legendary battles. The Hutts, under their fierce leader Cossack Nijik Arduv, and brilliant strategist Bunta Hastilik Shadru. They leveraged something that Zim did not expect: alliances with lesser species. The Hutts brokered the Treaty of Vontor with the warrior races of Nikto, Klatunians, and Vadrans, enlisting them as an army in exchange for protection and a share of the spoils. This indentured army turned the tide. In the final showdown, the Third Battle of Vontor, around 25,100 BBY, Zim's formidable war bots and fleets were decisively defeated by the combined Hutt and slave forces. Zim the Despot was captured or killed, accounts do vary here, and the Hutts stood victorious. Afterward, the Treaty of Vontor was sealed in formality, establishing that the Nikto, Klatunians, and Vadrans would serve the Hutts forever. These species remained integral servants in the Hutt society for thousands of years, a living legacy of the Hutt's ancient triumph, more than 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. To commemorate their victory, the Hutts instituted holidays like Bunta's Eve, named for General Bunta, who, like mentioned before, had become deified. They enshrined the tale in their cultural memory, though most in the galaxy, and probably many Hutts, have a fuzzy at best understanding of this ancient history. Under Hutt rule, the region around Nal Hutt became known as Hutt Space, a collection of star systems owned or controlled by the Khajiitics. The Hutts generally preferred indirect rule, happy to let the Republic expand elsewhere while they ran their own affairs. On a map of the ancient galaxy, you effectively had two great powers side by side: the Galactic Republic in the core and inner mid-rim, and the Hutt Empire in the outer mid-rim and Cycloda cluster. There was occasional conflict. The Hutts even allied with the Republic during the Tianese War around 24,000 BBY, acting against the remnants of Zim's empire. But for the most part, the Hutts remained a law unto themselves. Around 15,000 BBY, Hutt history took a dramatic turn. The so-called Hutt cataclysms, essentially a civil war or series of disasters, ravaged the Hutt Empire from within. It's said that massive clan wars and environmental collapse destroyed Varl, finally rendering their original homeworld uninhabitable, and it severely weakened their colonies. The Hutts were forced to consolidate on Nal Hutt. The ancient Hutt Empire collapsed, contracting to what we now consider Hutt space. In the aftermath, the surviving Hutt clans, under a visionary leader, Badilla Hastilik Amura, established a new system of governance, a council of elders to mediate disputes and establish the philosophical framework of the Khajiitic system. This was effectively the birth of the Hutt cartels as we know them. The clans turned away from open warfare and embraced a doctrine of controlling the galaxy through commerce, influence, and crime, rather than military campaigns. War in Hutt philosophy was deemed wasteful, when one could get rich and powerful more safely via business. This shift marks the transition from the Hutt Empire to the Hutt Cartel era. So over millennia, the Hutts reinvented themselves as the ultimate crime lords. By the time the Galactic Republic was blossoming, the Hutts were no longer conquering planets with armies. They were buying politicians, running black markets, and turning entire worlds into dens of vice. Hutt space persisted as an autonomous region, and Republic laws held no sway there. If you were a pirate looking for safe harbor, you fled to Hutt territory. And if you were a corporation needing dirty work done off the books, you quietly hired Hutt intermediaries. Over the millennia leading up to the Clone Wars, the Hutt Khajiitics dominated organized crime across the galaxy, controlling spice smuggling routes, slave trading rings, and more, and famously they have a stranglehold on Ryloth, exploiting the Twi'leks and their real spice trade, and kept the Nikto species essentially enslaved as enforcers and foot soldiers. Planets like Tatooine fell under Hutt control, and Nar Shaddaa, the moon of Nal Hutt, became a vertical metropolis teeming with refugees, smugglers, and other enterprises that made Coruscant's underlevels look tame. Nicknamed the Smuggler's Moon, it was effectively the Hutt version of Coruscant. All the galaxy's scum and villainy concentrated in neon-lit urban sprawl, governed by Hutt lords with no concept of morality. Fast forward to the last days of the Republic, and the Hutts maintained the official stance of neutrality during the Clone Wars, but they were a major factor behind the scenes. Both the Galactic Republic and Separatists courted the Hutts because Hutt space contained critical hyperspace routes, invaluable for connecting the Outer Rim to the core. In 22 BBY, the Republic struck a deal with Jabba after Jedi Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano safely returned Jabba's kidnapped infant son, Rhoda. This secured Hutt favor, or at least Jabba's favor, allowing Republic fleets to use Hutt hyperspace lanes, which would be a significant strategic win. The Grand Hutt Council, the assembly of the biggest Khajiitic leaders, mostly tried to stay out of direct war, preferring to profit from arms dealing and racketeering as the galaxy burned around them. By the time the Galactic Empire arose, the Hutts found a familiar arrangement. Emperor Palpatine largely left Hutt space alone in exchange for tacit cooperation. The Empire recognized that trying to subjugate Nal Hutt was not worth the effort. Better to have crime flourish in a controlled way than to spark even more chaos, when the biggest threat to his throne was the rebels. So while technically outside Imperial law, the Hutt clans continued business as usual, selling weapons, slaves, and contraband, oftentimes to Imperial clients. Hutts like Jabba grew even more powerful in this period, essentially becoming feudal lords in the Outer Rim regions, under this understanding with Imperial authorities, giving up crucial intel that often cut off this pipeline from criminal to rebel. What the rebels were doing was illegal, and so it often brought them into circles that were controlled by the Hutts. And so if any threat became too large, the Hutts were happy to give them up to the Empire. Now there were some outliers. Baldorian the Hutt became a rare Hutt Jedi Knight, serving the Force until falling to the dark side on some distant world. And so although this is our only example, it shows that it was at least technically possible. Another Hutt, Gracchus, was an oddity in that he was extremely muscular and was obsessed with collecting Jedi artifacts. During the Empire's reign, he ran an underground gladiatorial arena on Nar Shaddaa, and even tangled with Luke Skywalker. But these are very, very, very rare exceptions. The main story is almost all of them were somehow connected to the unassailable power of the 5 Hutt families, the core Khajiitics that ran galactic affairs. By 4 AVY, Jabba the Hutt remained supreme on Tatooine, until Leia was able to strangle the life out of him, earning her the nickname Hutt Slayer, and sending shockwaves throughout Hutt space. It was the first major blow the Hutt syndicates had suffered in ages. The immediate result was a power vacuum. Rival Khajiitics and surviving members of Jabba's clan scrambled to grab his territory and assets, and this upheaval coincided with the fall of the Empire and rise of the New Republic. The New Republic, unlike the Empire, had no unofficial truces with the Hutts, and of course that wasn't going to fly with their most important leader, Leia Organa. Both major political factions of the New Republic, the Populists and Centrists, equally detested the Hutts. So suddenly, Hutt cartels faced pressure on multiple fronts, internal gang wars, and a republic keen to crack down on rampant crime. Some outlying Hutt-controlled worlds seized this moment to free themselves. Nikto and Twi'lek populations revolted in places, emboldened by the Hutt disarray and New Republic support. The term Hutt Slayer became famous among Jabba's former slaves, and Leia Organa was hailed by the freed Nikto as a hero for killing the Hutt tyrant. It was likely the first time in centuries that a Hutt's death was celebrated across the stars, rather than being avenged. The post-Jabba period did not spell the absolute end of Hutt influence, but it changed the landscape. In the chaos, some criminal operations like Black Sun or newer syndicates, they all expanded and temporarily eclipsed the Hutts. The remaining Khajiitics formed a tighter council, and some even allied with the New Republic covertly in order to ensure their survival. And so this is definitely a low point for Hutt power, perhaps the lowest in 25,000 years. Though they would face an even greater threat a few decades later, when the Yuuzhan Vong, an extragalactic species of biotech-wielding invaders, swept into the galaxy. Hutt space was hit hard around 26 ABY. The Hutt Khajiitics tried their usual tricks, making deals, hiding, and sacrificing pawns, but the Vong were relentless and had no interest in bribes. The Hutt capital, Nal Hutt and Nar Shaddaa, were actually conquered and devastated by the Yuuzhan Vong. Many Hutts perished, and their grandiose cities were reduced to rubble. By the war's end in 29 ABY, the Yuuzhan Vong were defeated by the Galactic Alliance, but Hutt space was left in anarchy. For roughly a dozen years after, the Hutts struggled to regain their former standing. Their slave armies were scattered, their riches plundered, and this is absolutely the darkest era for their species on record. But like mentioned before, they are survivors. They eventually rebuilt their infrastructure. Utana Hutta, a region of Hutt colony worlds, remained untouched and became a seed from which they regrew influence. By around 40 ABY and beyond, the Hutts had reasserted some of their criminal empire, though it would never be quite as unchallenged as before. And so from the historical long view, they evolved on one of the harshest worlds in the galaxy, crafted by this evolutionary crucible to only seek more power and to survive. They grew the longest standing empire of all time, excelling in both military force and in their transition to crime bosses, controlling events throughout the entire galaxy for the entirety of its recorded history. Sometimes that influence was greater than others, being a slimy green Hutt fist of a tyrant, or other times just the hand that slid the credits over to the politician. But they were never without influence until these final decades. They outlasted the Rakata's infinite empire, tangled with Zim, and witnessed the Republic's rise and fall and rise again, played the Empire and Rebellion against each other, and endured into an era of galactic reunification, surviving the most violent extragalactic threat ever seen, only to emerge confident that they could grow it all again. From their mentality to their biology, the Hutts truly never seemed to stop growing. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. I really do need your help. But most important of all, remember, the Hutts are just providing the vices that your politicians are so eager to indulge in. And the Force will be with you. Always.
5 Hutt families on the distant world of Nal Hutta.
This territory is mine. Go back to Nal Hutta.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown and history of the capital of the Hutt crime empire, Nal Hutta, a world that was originally known as Evokar, and is not the homeworld of the Hutt species. I'll get to that in a bit, but let's start by looking at this planet's location at grid coordinates S12 on the galactic map. Right at the intersection of major hyperspace highways that brought wealth into and sent vices out of the heart of Hutt space, all within the outer rim of the galaxy. At a diameter of 12,150 kilometers, it was about the same size as Coruscant, and had a Type 1 oxygen mix, a breathable atmosphere for a majority of species, along with standard gravity and a 315-day year, and an 87-hour-long day, within a star system that contained a single sun and 6 planets totaling 27 moons. This is called a tube system, and roughly around the year 15,000 BBY, the Hutt invasion of Evokar began following the environmental destruction of their homeworld, Varl. There were some small Hutt colonies on the surface for hundreds of years before this, but it was still mostly controlled by the native Evoki. Once the Hutt homeworld was inhospitable, the major families decided to launch an all-out war. A war of legal technicalities, with armies of lawyers that drew up contracts and exchanged native lands for alien high-tech devices. Any Republic advisors brought in couldn't dispute these legal purchases, and as you could predict, they kept buying more and more land until the natives were pushed into a tiny area. As the Evoki could tell where this was going, some of them fled to the moon of Nar Shaddaa. Hindsight is 2020, and it's only obvious now that if they wanted to flee the debauchery and crime-ridden society of the Hutts, Nar Shaddaa was even worse than Nal Hutta, as the planet's moon was even more pleasant to a variety of species, becoming a sort of evil brother to Coruscant, with endless neon-covered buildings housing everything from gambling to slave and spice markets. A world where there was no concept of the term legal or illegal. In that, these worlds were similar, but Nal Hutta was for the Hutts from then on out. The once massive trees that made up the planet-spanning rainforests were flattened, and without them the swamps increased in size to almost completely cover this world. Some of this work to destroy Evokar was actually done by the remaining Evoki, who were captured as slaves and made to operate the machines that would tear down the last remnants of their civilization, as none of their architecture remains even as far back as 3500 BBY. These little genocides were just what came with running a galaxy-spanning crime empire. And they were incensed when an Evoki named Huttsbane started launching terrorist attacks on the refined Hutt cultural centers. As Suda Nemro lamented, the Evoki sold us this world for trinkets. Now they take up arms against their rightful masters. It's disgusting. With the incredibly thick atmosphere keeping everything constantly moist with showers and layers of fog, and now a global swamp headquarters right next to the rapidly expanding Sin capital of Nar Shaddaa, the Hutts finally had a world they could call home, at least until this one ran into a complete environmental collapse as well. And they would call it the Glorious Jewel, and as Borga the Hutt would put it, Quote, "In fact, we Hutts know a good deal about remaking worlds. When we arrived here from Varl, for example, Glorious Jewel was not the paradise you see now, but a primitive world of dense forests and untamed seas. Though to outsiders, this world was still a bit dreary and horrifying, with dragon snakes that would lay in wait under the thick, muddy waters, using their dozens of movement detection organs to pounce on any unsuspecting prey that it came across, often nesting in gnarled tree roots, which are also home to the She-Relian Toops, small starfish-like creatures that developed a symbiotic relationship with the Hutts, being able to clean up bacteria and food stuck under the flaps of skin. And over time, these became a fashion accessory, being worn by both Marlowe and Mama Hutt as headpieces.
You gon' sit in your stank, and you gon' pass the slime pods.
Slime pods were little organisms that were scooped up to make one of their favorite dishes, and would have blue glowing algae growing alongside it. While the skies were filled with these floating creatures and a pterodactyl-like bird, which did not appear to be registered on any galactic databases. And as their industry grew, chemical waste proved to be delicious to the then named Chemilizard that could reach up to 20 meters long. With this planet as their HQ, the Hutt families would continue to grow the economy of Nar Shaddaa, to the point that this area of space was considered an equal or even larger economy than Coruscant for the following 11,000 years. Some dark HoloNet conspiracy theorists think that it's suspicious that just as the Sith Empire was rising, the Utmian-Pabal hyperspace route collapsed when a nearby star went supernova, having the effect of drastically cutting off the trade to this Hutt-controlled area, rapidly accelerating the economy of the Republic capital of Coruscant at just the right time. This pushed the Hutts even deeper into the vice trade, and so these planets focused on what they were good at, Hutt space dominating the gray and black market goods, knowing that even if Coruscant got the big legit businesses, their leaders and politicians loved the vices bought in Hutt space, and their economy still depended on the key elements like bounty hunters, slavers, and data slicers, that were all still well under the control of the Hutt families. The 5 Hutt families was the informal term for the Council of Elders, the governing body of all Hutt space since the fall of their homeworld Varl, and since the taking of Nal Hutt in 15,000 BBY, they would stay in power from then on out, making this government one of the longest existing in the entire galaxy. The Elders could only come from the clans of the Ancients, which were the powerful families since their time on Varl, the clans Vosadi, Vandarajar, Jarama, Kajadir, Gorensla, Barish, Konalak, Basadi, and Dasilijik. And these families proved strong enough to retain this area of space, even as the Sith Empire would send countless spies to sow division on Nal Hutt and Nar Shaddaa, hoping to prop up local gangs and rival Hutt families.
We believe Nemro has been reluctant to lose Republic customers by publicly siding with the Empire. It's time he overcame this reluctance. We need to know what Nemro and his advisors are thinking before we can act. I want you to obtain access to the Nemro clan's inner circle.
One of the most famous from the Clone Wars era would be Gardula Basadi the Elder, the once ruler of Tatooine before Jabba of the Dasilijik clan was able to wrestle control from her. By 21 BBY, she would call an assembly of the Hutt ruling families to meet at her palace on Nal Hutt in order to discuss the fate of Zero the Hutt, who stole invaluable and incriminating Hutt council records to protect himself. Of course, the Coruscanti politicians and major corporations would not be surprised at the connections to industries and extravagances coming from Hutt space, but the public would go through a short-term outrage that would be bad for business, and might even lead to some theatrical justice being dealt out, a use of force that might result in the killing off of some Hutt or lower-level crime lord. For causing all this trouble, Zero would be detained in the massive dungeon of the Jabbas Palace, and keep in mind that all the families had palaces like these all over Nal Hutt, and even some from up-and-coming families that were not one of the clans of the Ancients. These palaces were made from the thick gnarl woods and shaped mud, but made for the perfect climate for the Hutts. And the more common buildings were of course smaller, but almost all structures on this planet are built using the same method. From Zero's mama's hut to rows of housing and shops, all built using this natural method. A funny irony from a species known for causing environmental destruction, but luckily once they got Nal Hutt from rainforest to swamp, at least this swamp was ideal for them, and now they almost live harmoniously with nature. To travel across this world, they would use an airboat-like hovercraft, or for long distance just go by starship. Their largest city was Bibosa, the capital, which contained the largest spaceport on Nal Hutt and was always seeing a constant stream of shady visitors of every species. The bazaar would lead to eateries, cantinas, and pawn shops like Pablo's, which had just about every piece of armor and weaponry you could hope for.
Pablo's pawn shop has everything a bounty hunter needs and more.
even having pieces of clone trooper armor for sale. Given how large-scale the Clone Wars were, it is very reasonable to assume that anything that touched the battlefront, from DC-15 blasters to droidicas, all could be purchased in Hutt space for the right amount of credits. In this hub, we can see that everything is under strict Hutt control, using mostly Nikto and Gamorrean guards on constant patrol, because even the underworld should be orderly. But this didn't mean they could protect you from being swindled in clever ways.
So you only gave him enough fuel to reach the nearest filling station on Arandia, which is owned by your brother. Well, that's a nice little money-making scam.
Now this world, the Crime Lord's Coruscant and seat of Hutt power, would go unchallenged for most of its history, affording the Hutts the chance to align themselves with either the Republic or Separatists or just stay neutral. Only tipping over to allow the Republic to use their space when Dooku was revealed to be the one behind the kidnapping of Jabba's son, Rhoda. The only one to ever force them into anything was Darth Maul, when he formed the Shadow Collective, using Death Watch Mandalorian forces to snowball his takeover of smaller crime syndicates like Black Sun, triggering the Pike Syndicate to voluntarily join to avoid conflict. And he was now brazen enough to take these forces directly to the Council in meeting on Nal Hutt. Imagine their disbelief as these long-lived leaders, the unopposed heads of clans that had ruled for 15,000 years, sitting in a palace on a homeworld they created, and hear the small humanoid say,
"Your lives, in exchange for Hutt space and everything in its borders."
This was not taken well, and as you would imagine, it's one of the most protected places in the galaxy, as hordes of bounty hunters and palace guards would spring up from behind the Hutt seats, and from every nook and cranny of the building. Intense fighting that pushed the invaders out, only for the Mando reinforcements to help push back and take the council room. Protocols were in place for this unlikely event, and all the Hutts were able to quickly flee to their ships, and were well off world by now, all except Aruba.
So the only thing that you can tell me is that I will find Jabba at Jabbas Palace.
After he was killed, the Shadow Collective immediately rushed to Tatooine, and with Mandalorian starfighters and ground troops, they quickly overtook Jabbas Palace, storming into the throne room to find Jabba and Gorga, who revealed that the Hutt elders had come to a new decision.
The mighty Jabba and the Hutt families have decided to join you.
Even into the Imperial and following New Republic era, the Hutts would retain control of Hutt space. These long-lived slugs knowing how to keep politicians in check by the use of credits, vice, and blackmail, and like with Darth Maul, cooperating just enough to retain their own power, or to allow those in power on Coruscant to save face. Though legends say they finally met their match in the year 26 ABY, where they tried to backstab the extragalactic Yuuzhan Vong, who promptly retaliated with an orbital bombardment. The Vong would reduce both Nal Hutt and Nar Shaddaa to a rich soil bed, literally using their organic tech, mostly advanced bacteria, to pump into the atmosphere of these worlds and break down both machines and people into a nutrient-rich dirt. In the relative blink of an eye, these masters of terraforming to create their unique living industries and technologies, called Vong forming, would prove to be the second time Nal Hutt was drastically changed to suit its new lords. What remained of the Hutt cartels were scattered across the stars, and forced to set up a new, sad and broken version of the ruling council on Tatooine, a world that couldn't be farther from their beloved, hazy, moist, and slimy swamp. And over the following decades after the Vong were defeated, some Hutts would try to make it back to their glorious jewel, though it would never again be the seat of Hutt power, or nearly as beautiful in their eyes as it was in the days of old. So that's it for its history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. The depiction of Gardulla's palace was something George Lucas had in his mind for decades, imagining the Hutts living in bulbous structures that rose up out of the foggy swamp. And it was only for the Clone Wars that the world received a large ring, but it also became more green, perhaps showing nature recovering from the Hutt's original deforestation and becoming a healthy, proper swampland, while also generating more space debris from waste and destroyed ships accumulating over thousands of years. The Khajiitic banners, or logos of the crime syndicate run by each family, were originally in the concept art right in front of their corresponding Hutt, but in the episode we see that the banners are between them, and that they do not always sit in the same seats. An interesting sort of humbleness among these cutthroat gangsters, perhaps showing a lessening of the individual and clan, and deference to the council as an entity, where they were all equal, sitting by banners that were not your own, but of your fellow clan elders. A nice touch in theory, even if the Hutts often plotted against and killed each other. And it's unclear why Zero's father's tomb would be on Teth, not Nal Hutt. Perhaps it has something to do with the dry environment, or that Teth was considered a more spiritual place to be buried, as it was a major Hutt cultural world, once ruled by the Ba'omar monks, who also built Jabbas Palace on Tatooine. But most important of all, remember, one man's toxic swamp is another Hutt's glorious jewel, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This complete life story of Jabba the Hutt will pull from every resource available over the decades. So let's get right into it. Jabba de Silajik Tior was born in 600 BBY on the planet Nal Hutt. The planet that served as the heart of Hutt power shaped his rise as one of the most infamous crime lords in the galaxy. If you want a complete breakdown on just the Hutt species themselves, be sure to check out the video in the cards. Before getting into his life specifically, there are a few things about Hutt biology that will be crucial to this story, as they played a huge role in his decisions. Hutts move by slithering, much like slugs, using the base of their bodies as a slow-moving foot, and some Hutts grow so large that they become completely immobile. Their skin was incredibly tough, resistant to almost all chemicals, and coated in a sweat made of oil and mucus, which helped them retain moisture even on dry worlds. Even if someone managed to pierce their thick skin, layers of bubble and muscle protected their vital organs, and they were also highly resistant to poisons, disease, and even digestion. Even Sarlaccs, it said, could not fully digest them, and would even spit them back out. One of the more unusual aspects of Hutt biology was their ability to choose their gender at will, and while they had a strong reproductive drive, they had an extremely low fertility rate, likely due to the destruction of their original homeworld, Varl. This led to speculation that Hutts developed the ability to self-impregnate, and because of this, the sex/gender line was really blurred. It could change in some time of crisis, or purely as a matter of personal expression. Because sexual dimorphism was the norm amongst most species in the galaxy, when a Hutt became pregnant, most thought of it as a female, and some would stick with that, like Jiliak, who was called a female after getting pregnant, while others like Bopara and Zorba did consider themselves male even though they gave birth. But also Hutts can take mates, like we see with Gorga and Anatro, but Hutts always gave birth to one child at a time and carried them in their brood pouch. It wasn't that they had to self-impregnate, it just seems that evolutionary pressures retained this option, due to that long period when the Hutts were on the brink of extinction. When Hutts are born, they were tiny, blind creatures weighing under 100 grams, instinctively clawing their way into the brood pouch to feed on milk. They stayed there for 50 years, emerging at about 70 kilograms or 154 pounds, and 1 meter or 3.3 feet long, but actually had the intelligence of around a 10-year-old human. So a Hutt 50-year-old is really only like a 10-year-old human. But they didn't have to stay in the brood pouch. We can wonder if Jabba was critiqued for this, but Jabba would take his son Rhoda out of the pouch much earlier, at only around 10 years old, and so mentally it really is closer to like a newborn. But this does start to speed up a bit, and we see that by 80 years old, Jabba had already begun establishing his criminal empire on the remote desert world of Tatooine. In 516 BBY, he moved his operations into an old Ba'omar monastery, using the planet's isolation to solidify his power. He started out as a high-risk gunrunner, working alongside his close friend Elphant Mon. During Senator Palpatine's rise to power, Jabba was one of many gangsters vying for dominance. His rivals included Cisse Fromm, a reigning kingpin of organized crime at that time, and Prince Shizor, an ambitious heir to the Black Sun Empire. While Fromm focused on playing war games, Jabba and Shizor were more strategic. They saw the political landscape shifting and worked to gain favor with the rising powers that would soon reshape the galaxy. Plagueis saw the intel from Jabba as an opportunity to manipulate events in his favor. He hoped to use the information to pull Jedi Master Dooku further toward the dark side, while also helping his apprentice Darth Sidious secure the role of Supreme Chancellor, especially since Senator Ainley Team, one of the conspirators, was a political rival. Jabba later provided another crucial tip, warning Plagueis about an assassination attempt planned by Gardula, working in tandem with the Bando Gora and Black Sun, all being orchestrated by King Ars Varuna on Naboo, who actually was a former ally of Plagueis, hoping to turn against the secret Sith Lord. But thanks to Jabba's warning, Plagueis escaped an orbital bombardment on Sojourn undetected. Everyone could assume he was killed, while Plagueis was actually rescued by Jabba's yacht, the Star Jewel. And ironically, Jabba had also played a small role in the events leading up to that attempt. Darth Sidious had sent Darth Maul to Coghive 7 prison in order to retrieve a nuclear device from the arms dealer Aram Radek. intending to pass that nuke on to the Bando Gora as the weapon to be used against Plagueis. When Jabba attacked the prison with the Star Jewel, Maul was able to escape with help from Kamari Vosa, eventually handing the nuclear device over to her. So Jabba inadvertently actually facilitated the nuclear attack on Plagueis, but he wasn't actually involved in that plot against the Sith Lord, and was there to warn and rescue him. By 32 BBY, the Naboo crisis reached its peak. Jabba and Gardulla met before that year's Boonta Eve Classic pod race. Gardulla had gone all out, presenting a full model of the track and even boasting a machine that could predict the winner. The machine showed Gascano as the victor, while Jabba's astromech R5X2 predicted that Sebulba would take the first place, with Gascano in second and Mahonic in third. But strangely enough, even the droid had some interest in the enslaved human Anakin Skywalker, something that no one else predicted. On the day of the race, Jabba played host to Gardulla in his VIP box at the Mos Espa Grand Arena, where he received wild cheers upon his arrival. To signal the start of the race, he theatrically spat a gorg into the starting gong, but his lack of genuine interest in the sport showed when he fell asleep during the event, needing Bib Fortuna to wake him up at the end. To his satisfaction, Anakin had won the race, meaning that unexpected droid tip-off to this side bet paid off enormously, while Gardulla was stunned and embarrassed. Around this same time, in the Jinlan Wastes, Gardulla hatched a plan to rally her criminal forces to wipe out the Tusken Raiders by hiring the deadly bounty hunter Aurra Sing to assassinate their Jedi leader Sharad Het. Meanwhile, Jabba had his own scheme in motion, sending his thugs to raid Tusken camps, provoking them into retaliatory attacks on the local settlers. He then intended to cash in by selling overpriced surplus weapons from Dredden's stockpile, as the civilians were desperately scrambling to get arms. Essentially price gouging during a crisis he manufactured, which was costing the lives of Tuskens and settlers, perpetuating the hatred towards these two groups. Gardulla's plan ultimately failed, forcing her to retreat to her palace on Mos Espa, and this marked one of her final clashes with Jabba. Eventually, the rivalry between these Hutts came to a breaking point. Tatooine was too small to share between these two enormous slugs. Wanting her permanently removed, Jabba granted an audience to Jango Fett, who had recently earned favor with the Hutt after bringing in the bounty on Longo 2 guns. Jabba hired Fett to eliminate Gardulla once and for all, and when Fett returned, Jabba was delighted to hear that she had been devoured by her own pet crate dragon, though he was surprised when Jango never came to collect his bounty. He later learned why. Jango had been decapitated by Jedi Master Mace Windu during the Battle of Geonosis, but Jabba would go on to conduct business with Jango's clone son, Boba. The execution of one of his favorite bounty hunters coincided with the start of the Clone Wars, and Jabba found himself in an unusual position, siding with the Galactic Republic, those goody two-shoes who had long plagued the Hutt Empire. Following the Republic's recapture of Serapin, a major energy hub, Jabba became involved in the Second Battle of Tatooine.
Zeon Finis, the captured Confederacy officer, had pointed Ichu to Tatooine, an outer rim world that was a nest of outlaws and pirates. The Hutt cartel was not a group to be trifled with, and somehow I knew they would be involved with the Confederacy in their treachery.
His newest rival, Borka the Hutt, had aligned himself with the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and Jabba decided that Borka had crossed the line. When the Republic's newly deployed clone forces on Tatooine proved too small to mount a full assault on the Confederacy's base, Jabba saw an opportunity and stepped in to tip the balance. After reinforcing their troops, Jedi Generals Ichu Shenjan and Na'at Reith took the fight to the Separatists, eventually defeating Borka the Hutt. Jabba was on a rival killing spree, and so he rewarded them with 5,000 Nova Crystals. But being the savvy crime boss he was, Jabba didn't limit his business to just one side of the war. He of course saw opportunities for profit on both sides. When Wat Tambor, one of the highest-ranking members of the Separatist Council and head of the Techno Union, reached out to Jabba, they made an agreement to smuggle large shipments of construction materials and cortosis to Metalorn. This would be used for the production of CB-3 cortosis battle droids, but his dealings with the Separatists didn't stay under wraps for long. Republic informant Rala Ponchar found out about Jabba's involvement, but before she could report back, she was captured by battle droids under the command of the Dark Acolyte Sato and locked away in Jabbas Palace. When the Jedi Council noticed her disappearance, they sent Anakin to investigate, and Jabba, tipped off by Aurra Sing, quickly put a bounty on Anakin's head, hoping to get rid of the young Jedi before he uncovered anything. Even with the bounty hunters coming after him, Anakin managed to break into the palace, free Ponchar, and take down Sato before passing the evidence of Jabba's involvement to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Around this same time, Jango Fett's clone son, Boba Fett, came across his father's journal, which led him to seek out Jabba. But before he could reach the Hutt, he had a run-in with the deadly separatist commander Dirge. But after escaping, Boba eventually did find himself working for Jabba. The Hutt was more than happy to take him in, not only because of Boba's skills, but in the odd morality of these thug slugs. He did feel a responsibility to repay the favor Jango had done for him years earlier by eliminating Gardulla. Though Boba worked for Jabba, he also had his own separate plans, maintaining ties with the Separatists and Count Dooku, while of course carving out his own reputation. But as the Clone Wars progressed, Jabba found himself needing the Jedi's help. His son Rhoda had been kidnapped, and in exchange for help, Jabba offered the Republic safe passage through Hutt-controlled space. A crucial advantage since the Separatists controlled most major hyperlanes in the Outer Rim. Jabba had already sent bounty hunters to track down his son, but they returned empty-handed and beheaded. Count Dooku and the Confederacy had actually orchestrated the kidnapping, allowing the Jedi to rescue Rhoda while manipulating the situation to make it look like they were the kidnappers. But when this plan backfired and the Jedi did return his son, they ultimately earned Jabba's trust, securing his support for the Republic against the Confederacy, while being furious at finding out that the real mastermind behind the scheme was his own uncle, Zero Dizilajik Tior, as there was no peacetime in Hutt politics. No time that you would be without a rival, even if it was your own uncle. Later, Baron Noltulwiski Papanoida, chairman of the Pandoran Assembly, came to Jabba for help in tracking down his kidnapped daughters, Chi-Ikwe and Che-Amanwi. Papanoida demanded a blood sample to prove Greedo's involvement. Jabba allowed it, and once the test confirmed the match, Greedo immediately confessed that he had been working with the Separatists. He then led the Pantorans to Mos Eisley, where one of the girls was being held. In another incident, Jabba hired bounty hunter Cad Bane to get intel on the Senate building. After Bane's success, Jabba and the Hutt Council debated whether to release Zero from prison. Ultimately, they hired Bane to break him out.
Oh, I have no illusions about the fact that my escape was a result of the highly sensitive knowledge that I possess. A hollow diary cataloging the nefarious deeds of this council.
But later, Jabba turned on Zero, sending Sai Snoodles to retrieve incriminating information on him. And just through personal reasons, Sai would end up betraying and killing Zero before handing Jabba the Diary of the Hutts. By 20 BBY, Darth Maul and his brother Savage Opress and Pre Vizsla of Death Watch confronted the Hutt ruling council on Nal Hutta. Their demands were clear and bold. The Mandalorians would let them live if they handed over all of Hutt territory. Jabba and the other elders laughed off this demand and instead sent bounty hunters after them. While Gorga and Jabba monitored the situation via hologram, all the other Hutts managed to escape except for Aruba. Soon after this, Maul and his forces launched an assault on Jabba's palace on Tatooine, storming the monastery, and they eventually reached the throne room, where Maul and his allies forced Jabba and Gorga into submission, bringing the mighty crime lord under the control of the Shadow Collective. Jabba relied on a number of lieutenants to help him manage his ever-expanding criminal empire, but none were as important as his major domo, Narun Kuthis. He respected Kuthis more than most, but there was a huge problem. Kuthis knew too much. He couldn't risk letting him retire, so instead, he granted him a swift death as a final reward for his service. With Kuthis gone, a power struggle broke out between Bib Fortuna and a human smuggler named Bidlo Corve, each vying for that coveted position of Jabba's right-hand man. As much as people critique the Hutts, their corruption does serve as a mirror, seeing the worst things that could be brought out of people, even when they can see how detrimental it is to themselves. Everyone who became a spice dealer knew other dealers that were killed. Spice users had seen plenty of spice addicts. And these two men knew that Kuthis had been killed by Jabba, yet still, due to the prestige and credits, they would do anything to become Jabba's right-hand man. And enjoying this rivalry, Jabba played them up against each other. When Jabba received his new pet Rancor, he decided to make a spectacle of this competition. Corve became the creature's first public meal, and Fortuna simply won the position by default. A real twisted look into Jabba's psychology, and that he wanted to be utterly unpredictable and cruel, sometimes basing a promotion off of service and loyalty, other times just casually ending someone's life, just to show how little it all meant to him. whether it be these coveted titles people scrambled over, or even life itself. Jabba's father, Zorba, was arrested and sentenced to prison on Kip for illegal gemstone mining. When a bribery attempt to free him failed, Twi'lek took control of the Twi'lek clan, which made Jabba next in line for leadership over the entire cartel. Now, of course, Jabba was always hiring bounty hunters, but one of his favorite was a Gand named Zuckuss. Over the years, Zuckuss completed many high-profile jobs for Jabba, earning a strong reputation in the crime lord's inner circle. Eventually, Jabba suggested that Zuckuss team up with Forlom, a protocol droid that had been modified by Jabba's workers with upgraded programming. The two proved to be a highly effective team, and they became regulars at the palace. And it was around this same time that the Clone Wars came to an end, and we see the rise of the Galactic Empire. The Hutt Empire is one of the longest in galactic history, so although it might seem weird, this wasn't that big a deal to them. It was business as usual. You're still paying off whoever's in charge at the local level, whether they have a republic or an imperial emblem on their fancy hat. At least, that's how it usually went, but Jabba was outraged to see that he had an imperial bounty on his head. There's two ways to look at this. Either Palpatine was trying to completely consolidate power, but that seems a little tactless and inconsistent with his actions later. It's most likely that he knew that by killing the famous Jabba, it would be a great PR stunt, showing that he was fighting crime and maintaining peace, but he also knew enough about Hutt politics to know that some other Hutt would just step in. And when that new slug spread more chaos, they would need Big Palpy's government to come in and save the day again. The Empire actually needs some level of crime and even rebellion. It works as a foil to make themselves look better. But whatever the case, Jabba did not stop his criminal dealings. He even had a major conflict in 15 BBY when rival crime lord C.C. Fromm and his son Tig tried to develop a devastating new weapon, the satellite called Trigon 1. This satellite supposedly had enough firepower to destroy planets, and the Fromm gang planned to use it to force other cartels, including Jabba's, into submission. But the plan fell apart when a speeder racer named Thal Jobin, with help from R2-D2, destroyed this superweapon before it could be deployed, with that little droid always happening to pop up in galactic history just in time to be a conduit for the Force's will. And seeing an opportunity to crush the Fromm gang while they were still recovering from the loss of their massive investment, Jabba put a bounty on them, and it was Boba Fett who initially found them, as C.C. Fromm had hired him to capture Jobin and his friends, hoping to get revenge. Fett accepted the job as a favor to the Elder Fromm, who had helped him in the past, but the chase went badly for Fett, who lost his speeder, his droid, and nearly his life, and furious, he decided his debts to the Fromms had been settled and instead turned them over to Jabba.
Blunder! Your meddling has cost me my droid, my speeder, and almost my neck, Tig Fromm.
C.C. survived only by cutting a deal that heavily favored Jabba. He handed over a massive cut of the Fromm family's profits and pledged his army of Anudak clones to help Jabba eliminate the remnants of the Mandalorian Death Watch, with whom he still had a score to settle. Then, about 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, Jabba took his yacht, Star Jewel, to pay a visit to an old acquaintance, Gar Sapoon. Once he arrived, he casually informed Gar that there was a bomb somewhere in his palace. The Galactic Empire set Kosh Corp to investigate, but no bomb was found, and the situation escalated into a heated trade war, during which Jabba outmaneuvered Gar at every turn. This drove Gar to the point of madness where he attempted to kill him, but Jabba responded by releasing a highly venomous Tromonid, which immediately bit his would-be assassin. Now poisoned, Gar had no choice but to negotiate. Jabba dangled the antidote in front of him, demanding everything they had traded in return. When Gar, still clinging to his pride, reminded Jabba about the supposed bomb and dared him to detonate it, Jabba simply played along, keeping the upper hand as always. Things took a turn for the worse when Jabba casually called Gar by his real name, Sinopu Bomor. That name meant something to Kosh Kerp, the Imperial investigator, who immediately realized Bomor was the man who killed his family. Without hesitation, Kerp fired a blaster shot at him. The shot ricocheted and blew Gar's head apart. At that moment, Kup realized the awful truth. He was the bomb all along, manipulated by Jabba into taking revenge on the Hutt's behalf, showing the Hutts could be cruel, but often unexpectedly clever. As Jabba's crew left the planet aboard Star Jewel, Scoopa, the ship's captain, spotted a Nuffin freighter that seemed like an easy target, and thinking it was full of valuable cargo, Jabba, Bib Fortuna and 2 Weequay guards boarded the ship, leaving a Gamorrean guard behind to watch Starjewel. But things didn't go as planned. The group was ambushed and captured by the ship's owner, Princess Nampi. She threw the guards and Bib into the larder, keeping Jabba and Scuppa for a personal audience. Jabba refused to give up his fortune, so Nampi had him locked up too. Scuppa, sensing this opportunity, realized he now controlled Jabba's finances and tried to save himself by agreeing to marry Nampi. But what he didn't realize until it was too late was that Nampi's species devoured the male on their wedding night. He went from her husband to her appetizer in a matter of moments. When Jabba was summoned to be the main course, he quickly sized up this situation and turned it to his advantage. You see, these slug thugs really are creative, and being so long-lived, they're used to planning out things over a long period. And years before this, Jabba had implanted a remote-controlled device in Scuppa's skull that could release xenoboric acid if he ever betrayed him. Now holding all the power, Jabba offered Nampi a deal: hand over her wealth, or he would activate the device. When she refused, he pushed the button without a second thought, and within seconds, she exploded. Once the mess was cleared, Jabba freed Bib and the guards, and they looted Nampi's treasure hold. Amused by the carnage, Jabba even joked that Bib should, quote, wear his boots as he trudged into the remains. Jabba then planned to sell Nampi's ship to crime lord Cabrul Num, but there was still the matter of her remaining crew. Bib suggested selling them into slavery, but Jabba had a more twisted idea, launching them into space, quote, just to see 'em pop. When Jabba met with Num, the meeting started off well, but things soured when they began arguing over a contract hit. Num wanted Jabba to assassinate his rival, Vu Chusker, but Jabba wasn't interested, and annoyed, Num had Jabba locked in a spare room. But Num's son, Rusk, saw an opportunity and secretly hired Jabba to kill his own father instead. Jabba happily took this job, suffocating Num in his sleep. With Num dead, Jabba assumed he would take Rusk on as a business partner, but Rusk had other plans. He double-crossed Jabba, throwing him into the deep hold, and there, Jabba met another member of the Num family, Rusk's sister, Norba, who also wanted her brother dead. Always looking for opportunities, Jabba agreed to this too, and together they were able to escape and crush Rusk in his own office. But this family was so backstabbing they even impressed the Hutt. Norba wasn't looking for an ally either. She immediately had Jabba thrown back into the deep hold, and later when she came to gloat, she told Jabba she wanted Vu Chusker dead. Amused, Jabba leaned against the bars and told her to come closer, and as soon as she did, he lunged forward, dragging her into his mouth and ate her alive. Never underestimate a Hutt. With her out of the way, he took her keys and escaped, and while making his way out, Jabba ran into none other than Vu Chusker himself. And just to throw off everyone, without wasting time, he smashed Chusker into the ground before floating back to his ship on a repulsor sled. In hindsight, he thought to himself that he just should have killed Chusker in the first place. By the time Jabba returned to his palace, his majordomo Bib Fortuna had hatched plans to overthrow him. Bib had recruited 6 disgruntled minions, including Nivik, to torture information out of his guards and eventually kill them. But just as they began to execute their plan, 2 of Jabba's guards, Gra'um and Maramba, unleashed a pack of vicious Frekkers, and the palace erupted in chaos. Bib and his co-conspirators managed to kill the creatures, which ironically made Jabba see him as a loyal hero. And all of Bib's co-conspirators died in this fight, so the failed coup was buried along with them, and Bib was the only one who knew how close he came to treason, with his ambition tamed, at least for now. And Jabba's rise to power got a boost when he and his great-uncle Jiliak took interest in a young, cocky smuggler named Han Solo. Pressed by Han's skills, they hired him to run spices across the galaxy, making big profits off the illegal spice trade. Han proved himself quickly, and was soon trusted with high-risk jobs like the infamous Kessel Run. What Han didn't know at the time was that Jabba and Jiliak were preparing a major power move against the rival Basadi clan, specifically targeting their spice refining operations on Ylesia. While running a shipment for the Dazilajit clan, Han barely escaped a vicious pirate attack, which he then blamed on the Basadi. Outraged, Orik the Hutt, the leader of the Basadi clan, and his son Durga demanded a hearing before the Hutt Council on Nal Hutt, and that council ultimately ruled in favor of the Basadi, clearing them of any wrongdoing. But that wasn't enough for Jabba and Jiliak. They decided Uruk had to die. They contacted High Priest Torienza of Ylesia and arranged for a deadly Malkite poison to take him out. The plan worked, but soon after the Hutts faced an even bigger threat, run-in with Imperials. Moff Sarshield declared a crackdown on Nal Hutt and Nar Shaddaa, putting the Hutt criminal empire at risk. When bribery failed, Jabba and Jiliak turned to Han Solo, telling him to buy off the Imperial Admiral leading the assault. And Han did pull this off, even securing the Empire's battle plans. Meanwhile, the Hutts hired Drea Renthal's mercenary fleet to reinforce Nal Hutt, and with the smugglers and mercenaries working together, and armed with this stolen Imperial strategy, the defenders of Nar Shaddaa pulled off a shocking victory, forcing the Empire to back off and allowing the Hutts to keep their hold on the Outer Rim. Not long after, Orak's son Durga started piecing things together and suspected Jiliak of orchestrating his father's assassination. Under old law, he challenged Jiliak's right to rule, and in the ensuing duel, killed him. While most beings would have been shaken by the loss of a close ally, especially when you live so long, Jabba saw nothing but opportunity. Without hesitation, he murdered Jiliak's now orphaned child, eliminating any future competition and cementing himself as the uncontested leader of the Desilijek Khajiit. At this point, Jabba was at the height of his power, a time when the Hutts had just defeated the Empire. And so now he had better eyes on how everything ran within this Khajiit. Jabba's main source of spice was a Rimbit named Morath Dul, who had a talent for recruiting competent smugglers, and he made their whole operation run smoothly. Dul had no loyalty beyond credits, and he worked with Han Solo and Chewbacca many times, but also wouldn't hesitate to sell them out if the price was high. And that's exactly what happened when Dul tipped off Imperial authorities about a spice run Solo was making for Jabba, leading to an Imperial patrol intercepting the cargo. At first, Jabba blamed Han entirely for the lost shipment, holding him responsible for this massive financial hit. But over time, he started to suspect Dul was skimming spice from the operation. And when Jabba finally confirmed Dul's betrayal, he put a bounty on him, and knowing he was a marked man, Dul staged a prison revolt on Kessel, hoping to cause enough chaos to cover his tracks. And his plan worked. Half the prison guards were secretly on his payroll, and it made this takeover relatively easy. But in the end, he was caught and dragged before Jabba. Begging for mercy, Dul bargained for his life, even offering one of his eyes as payment. And Jabba was so amused, he accepted this trade. With Dul punished, the never-predictable Jabba went to place the full blame of the lost cargo back on Solo. By 0 BBY, in the official beginning of the Galactic Civil War, Jabba had cemented himself as the most powerful crime lord in the Outer Rim, and likely in the entire galaxy. His near monopoly on the glitter stem spice trade gave him immense wealth and influence, and under his leadership, the Desilijek Khajiit had become the most dominant Hutt dynasty, overtaking all of their long-term rivals. But even at the peak of his power, he faced ongoing problems. Chronic illness left him in constant discomfort, and of course there was constant plotting against him by his own lieutenants. The only ones he truly trusted were his Nimbanal accountant Mosip Benid and Elephant Mon, whom he had appointed as his chief of security at the palace. And he still just couldn't get over what a massive financial hit Han Solo had given to his empire, dumping that massive shipment of glitter stem, all just to save his own neck from Imperial customs. And he could have paid the right people to make sure that that spice disappeared from the evidence lockers. But Solo dumped it all into space. It was long scattered across the stars. And after he gave the human numerous chances to pay him back, Jabba eventually put a bounty on his head.
Solo? Yes, Greedo. As a matter of fact, I was just going to see your boss. Tell Jabba that I've got his money.
Greedo attempted to collect it, but Han shot him dead first. And not long after, Jabba personally confronted Han in the Millennium Falcon's hangar bay. But rather than outright kill him, he gave Han a chance to settle the debt by adding a 15% premium to the original sum. Before leaving, Jabba warned him that if he delayed this payment again, he'd put a bounty so large on him that he wouldn't be able to set foot in a civilized system.
Jabba, you're a wonderful human being.
After the Battle of Yavin, rumors spread that Jabba had been one of the key figures funding the Imperial Dark Trooper project, providing smuggling ships to the Empire, which were used to keep this thing a secret even from most Imperials. His men were also hunting Kyle Katarn on behalf of General Rom Mak, but Katarn and Jan Ors managed to eliminate the mercenaries chasing them. But as they were leaving Nar Shaddaa, Jabba's forces captured their ship, the Moldy Crow, and threw them into the Star Jewel, intending to feed them to his Kell dragons. Katarn managed to escape, and this didn't really seem to faze Jabba. A few days later, Han attempted to settle his debt by giving Jabba 500,000 credits worth of an ancient Sith treasure. He accepted, but noted that this wasn't enough, and he kept the bounty on Han's head. But for a brief time, Jabba actually forgave Han of his debt when Solo saved Mosep Benid, that man that was crucial to his operation, and Han even completed another Kessel run for Jabba. But peace didn't last long. When Mossop found the wreckage of Crimson Jack's ship, which Jabba had helped to build, and discovered that Han played a role in its destruction, Jabba was furious with him again and reinstated the bounty. In the years following the Battle of Yavin, Jabba found himself in a fierce turf war with Lady Valerian and her criminal organization, which was also based on Tatooine. At one point, Lady Valerian sent a team of elite off-world assassins to kill him, but Jabba got wind of the plot and had his men ambush and kill Valerian's assassins during the assault on her strategic command bunker. Remember, the Hutts are always playing the long game, and it was actually years earlier, before the Battle of Yavin, that Jabba entered a business deal with the weapons dealer Tiber Zahn. But neither man saw the partnership as anything more than temporary. When Tiber learned that Jabba had purchased a rare artifact at an exorbitant price, he decided to strike, and took a team of mercenaries to Felucia, where Jabba was meeting with Imperial buyers. Tiber managed to steal the artifact, but was captured in the process, and while imprisoned, he sent a transmission to Jabba, taunting him and claiming that he had sent an assassin to kill him. But Tiber's ally, Uri Fen, broke him out, and Tiber went on to form the Zahn Consortium, forever vowing revenge against Jabba. One of the most notable clashes between Jabba and the Consortium was the Battle of Hypori. Using a listening post on Seleucami, Jabba pinpointed the Consortium's key bases and sent saboteurs to destroy them. At first he was successful, but Tiber quickly retaliated, tracking down Jabba's droid factory on Hypori and launching a full-scale assault. The battle turned against Jabba when Bossk, lured over by triple the pay, betrayed him and joined Tiber. Meanwhile, Uri Fen hacked into Jabba's Droideka Mark II droids, turning them against their master, and with Jabba's forces overwhelmed, Tiber forced him to agree to a ceasefire that granted the Zahn Consortium control of Seleucami and Hypori, and in exchange, Jabba was forced to call off the bounty on Tiber's head. Now, after the Battle of Hoth, Darth Vader sent an agent named Jix to spy on Jabba while also keeping an eye on Luke Skywalker. Posing as a mercenary looking for work, Jix ended up in front of Jabba after being picked up by Swoop Gang leader Big Giz. Meanwhile, Jabba received word that Luke was now worth more dead than alive. Though Jix, confused, had been under the impression that Vader wanted Luke alive. When the Swoop Gang leader ambushed Luke, Jix stopped Giz from killing him by knocking him out with a rock. Luke quickly took care of the rest of the gang, while another swooper escaped with Jix. Jabba was both furious and intrigued. He suspected that Jix was more than he claimed to be. After all, the swoopers were far too dumb to have turned on him on their own. At the same time, he was preoccupied with Boba Fett's arrival, as the bounty hunter was now bringing in Han Solo, frozen in carbonite, seeking to collect that reward. Jabba got even more suspicious about Jix when one of his aides caught him tampering with security codes. Jix killed the aide, took the security key, and transmitted a message to Vader. It was just when Jabba was beginning to investigate the murder that Boba Fett arrived. Of course, he had to try and undercut Fett by offering a reward of 5,000 credits to anyone who could bring him Solo first, but Fett was still holding onto his prize by the time he presented it, and Jabba grudgingly paid the bounty. With Solo now in his possession, Jabba's palace became a haven for bounty hunters, and this became a grand celebration. Bossk and Fett stayed for the duration of Han's captivity, but Zuckuss did eventually leave to go on a hunt. With Solo frozen in carbonite and his status as Tatooine's ruler unquestioned, Jabba indulged in an increasingly extravagant lifestyle. One of his most outrageous expenditures was an enormous, no-rules vehicular demolition event, a spectacle filled with death, destruction, and a massive betting pool. The tournament attracted a wide variety of contestants, from high-profile names like Boba Fett and the Doug pod racer Pugwis, to unexpected entries like the Jawa warlord Witten. Others like the Wookiee mechanic Quagga and the deserting Imperial General Otto all joined out of their desperate need for credits. Some, like bounty hunter Aurra Sing, entered for revenge, while others like Tamtel Screech, who was actually Lando Calrissian in disguise, and Malakili, the Rancor Keeper, were just there to impress Jabba and climb the ranks. And not all participants were willing. There were 2 rebel pilots, Tia and Gia, along with Alderaanian smuggler Wade Vox, who were forced into the tournament against their will. And Jabba raked in an obscene amount of credits from the betting, celebrating yet another victory. But just as he was basking in his fortune, 2 droids arrived, carrying a message that would change everything. Jabba was thrilled to have Han Solo as his personal trophy, hanging the carbon-frozen smuggler in his audience chamber as his favorite decoration. But the Rebel Alliance wasn't about to let Han stay in Jabba's clutches. They came up with a complex rescue plan, starting with Luke sending R2-D2 and C-3PO to Jabba's palace with a message and his gifts. The droids were escorted past the Gamorrean guards and delivered Luke's request to negotiate for Han's release. Jabba was amused, but immediately rejected it and put the droids to work instead. That day, Jabba indulged in entertainment listening to the Max Rebo Band perform Jedi Rocks while watching his enslaved Twi'lek dancer Ula. When he demanded an encore and tried to pull Ula toward him, she resisted, but unbothered by anyone's suffering, he simply pressed a button on his throne, opening a trapdoor beneath her and sending her straight to his Rancor, who was just the latest of countless souls sacrificed to this beast. Right after that, Princess Leia arrived, but of course described as the bounty hunter Bosch, with Chewbacca playing the role of a prisoner. Jabba and the disguised Leia haggled over Chewie's bounty, but when she pulled out a thermal detonator and threatened to use it, the Hutt was impressed by her boldness. They settled on 35,000 credits, and Jabba had Chewbacca thrown into the dungeon, while Bosch remained in place, waiting for the perfect moment. In the chaos caused by her arrival, several prisoners from Jabba's demolition games, including Alderaanian smuggler Wade Vox and the rebel twins Tia and Gia, they did manage to escape. And later that night, Leia snuck into Jabba's chambers and freed Han from his carbonite prison. But Jabba had sniffed out the betrayal, and Han, still weak from hibernation sickness, tried to talk his way out of it, but Jabba mocked him, saying it was too late for that. He had Han thrown in a cell with Chewbacca and turned his attention to Leia. Now that Ula was gone, Jabba decided to replace her by enslaving Leia. Ignoring her threats, he had his guards bring her to him, licking her face in a disgusting display of dominance. As the Max Rebo Band played, Jabba's dancers dressed Leia in a revealing Huttese slave outfit, placing a collar and chain around her neck to keep her bound to his throne. And all this time, and like always, plots to assassinate Jabba were brewing inside the palace. Jaquil, secretly working for Lady Valarian, managed to get his hands on Leia's thermal detonator, only for Bib Fortuna to steal it from him. Tasic had planted a bomb on Jabba's sail barge, while Reis was plotting his own attack, unaware that Jabba had implanted a short-range explosive inside him that could be detonated with a single phrase. At one point, Jabba decided to send Leia to Boba Fett's quarters as a gift. Fett, though uninterested, chose not to return her right away, knowing that sending her back too soon might anger Jabba and lead her to being fed to the Rancor. And as the hours passed, Jabba's paranoia was growing. He suspected that his chef, Porcellus, was trying to hex him through his food, but he had secretly been cooking meals for Han, trying to help him recover from hibernation sickness. When Leia tried to prove Porcellus's innocence by eating a sample of the sand maggot kidneys Jabba had been served, she became nauseated, as the dish was completely indigestible for humans. And this just got a great laugh out of Jabba, entertained by her misery. A few days later, Luke finally arrived at Jabbas Palace. Most of the court was asleep when he entered, but Bib Fortuna, under the influence of a Jedi mind trick, brought him straight to Jabba's throne room. Luke demanded Han and Chewbacca's release. Jabba would be killed if he refused. The Hutt laughed off the threat. When Luke used the Force to pull a guard's blaster into his hand, Jabba reacted by springing another trap, dropping Luke and an unfortunate Gamorrean named Jubnuk into the Rancor pit. Jabba and his court roared with laughter as the Rancor quickly devoured the terrified Jubnuk. Then it turned its attention to Luke. The Jedi managed to survive by bashing its claw with a rock, ramming a bone into its mouth, and darting between its legs to reach the back of the lair. There he would find the skull of Bidlo Corvée. The Force worked in mysterious ways, and this man who was long ago callously killed by Jabba ended up providing the skull that would be used to trigger the heavy gate to slam down on the Rancor's head. The laughter in Jabba's throne room fell silent. Furious over the death of his prized pet, Jabba lashed out, choking Leia in anger before ordering his guards to bring the remaining rebels before him. Mara Jade was at Jabba's palace under orders from Emperor Palpatine, described as the dancer Arika, with the secret mission of assassinating Luke Skywalker. Ironically, this is the man she would later marry and join in the new Jedi Order. Jabba's security officer Melina Karnas grew suspicious of her, convinced that she was planning to assassinate the Hutt, and attempted to have her imprisoned. Though she failed, her interference made it impossible for Mara to carry out her mission. As payback for the death of his pet, Jabba declared, through C-3PO's translation, that Luke, Han Solo, and Chewbacca would be taken to the Great Pit of Carkoon and fed to the Sarlacc. Leia was the only one spared, as Jabba still had other plans for her, and after the prisoners were taken away, Jabba also sentenced his chef, Porcellus, to death, believing that Ula and Jubnuk's deaths after eating his food. In this utterly degenerated mind of Jabba at this point, he somehow saw the horrible fates of Ula and Jubnuk, their bad luck, as being proof that his meals were hexed. That even though he facilitated their death, It was because he was sort of manipulated by these mysterious forces. Before boarding his sail barge Katana, Jabba was approached by the head of security and his only real friend, Elephant Mon. Having spoken with Luke in the dungeons, Mon had sensed the power of the Force within him and tried to convince Jabba to let him go. But Jabba refused to listen, and with that, Mon chose not to accompany him to Carkoon, effectively ending their decades-long friendship over the return of a Jedi. And while Jabba and his entourage traveled aboard Katana, the prisoners were transported to their execution on a smaller skiff. Leia tried to warn her friends through a window, but Jabba eventually forced her to return to him, pulling him closer on his throne. He smugly told her that in time she would learn to appreciate him and made her drink from his goblet. Once they arrived at the pit, Jabba mockingly offered the prisoners a chance to beg for mercy, but Luke instead issued one final warning. Jabba again laughed it off and ordered them thrown in the Sarlacc. And just as Luke was about to be dropped in, R2-D2, who had been working aboard the sail barge, launched Luke's hidden lightsaber from a compartment in his dome. Luke caught it midair and immediately attacked the skiff guards, throwing Jabba's court into chaos, and amid the panic, Leia shorted the lighting system, momentarily distracting Jabba. Seizing the opportunity, she leapt over Jabba's tail, whipped her chain around his massive neck, and began strangling him. Desperately, Jabba triggered a hypnotic command implanted in Rhys, hoping to force him into grabbing Leia and self-destructing. But before Rhys could act, Jabba collapsed, dead at Leia's hands. Freed from her restraints by R2, Leia met Luke on the top deck of Katana, where he had her aim the deck gun at the ship's interior. It ignited a massive explosion that tore through the barge, and the rebels escaped on one of the skiffs as Katana was consumed in flames, turning the once mighty Jabba the Hutt's luxurious vessel into his funeral pyre. With Jabba gone, chaos engulfed his criminal empire. In Mos Eisley, two low-level criminals, Kes Dallas and Kisa Shaki, tried to take over his smuggling operations, triggering a violent gang war. And within a week of Jabba's death, a group of 4 war droids known as the Mos Eisley Mourners were activated and began hunting down anyone they identified as responsible for his downfall. Jabba's death also had unexpected benefits. Many of those who owed him massive debts were suddenly free of them, earning Luke a surprising amount of goodwill from the underworld. But of course not everyone saw this as a good thing. Jabba's father, Zorba the Hutt, had been recently freed from prison, and he put a bounty on Leia in retaliation. This bounty was later extended to Han, Chewbacca, and Luke, and it wasn't until Leia became Chief of State of the New Republic that the Hutts finally withdrew the bounty, not wanting to provoke the galactic government any further. Luke's role in Jabba's death made him, and by extension all Jedi of the later order that he would found, the constant enemy of the Hutts. Kappa, along with many other Hutt leadership, would hold this grudge for years, eventually turning against Mara Jade specifically and the New Republic. And they vowed to be tough on crime, though I'm sure the Hutts were used to hearing this. Jabba's nephew, Gorga the Hutt, arrived at his late uncle's palace hoping to claim part of his inheritance, and he was given a small statue of a Hutt, which just looked like a minor trinket, but it actually contained the key to Jabba's secret treasure hoard. But Gorga wasn't the only one after Jabba's legacy. Spiker, who had somehow survived his encounter with Han Solo, Boba Fett, and Big Giz, who had also managed to live through his clash with Jix and Luke, returned after Jabba's death, and there became something of a legendary treasure hut in the sands of Tatooine. But the trap was a pre-recorded message from Jabba himself. He had anticipated that Giz would still be alive and attempt to steal from him. As the security system self-destructed, it nearly killed these bikers, forcing them to flee. And as a final insult to Gorga, Spiker and Giz dropped Jabba's funeral urns directly onto him and his henchmen, shattering them in the process. And his story comes to an end, leaving a very surprising legacy. If you remember, he had secretly helped the Empire with the Darksaber project, and while scavenging his abandoned palace on Tatooine, agents of Durga the Hutt's Basadi clan, his most intense rivals, recovered access codes to former Imperial databases on Coruscant, and using these codes, they retrieved schematics for the Death Star. Complete schematics in every way. In theory, they could construct their own superweapon. And so while tangentially and without even knowing it, Jabba had left behind one last and what could be the greatest contribution to the Hutt Empire in the entirety of its thousands of years of history. But that's it for the complete life of Jabba the Hutt. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. It really does help me out. Subscribe so you don't miss anything. But most important of all, remember, Jabba the Hutt is a timeless archetype, and many are eager to serve him. And the Force will be with you, always.
Land of Calrissian and poor Chewbacca never return from this awful place. How horrid!
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the monastery turned Hutt Palace turned HQ of the Mandalorian Resurgence, looking at its original cult builders, a tour of the interior, its location on Tatooine, and importance in galactic history, as well as the many changes over the years. The story of the palace starts 700 years before the Battle of Yavin, when a group of Ba'omar monks arrived on Tatooine with hopes of establishing a sacred religious enclave. Coming from Teth, even this planetary migration was an extension of their asceticism, as they were not a Force-worshipping cult like the Sith or Jedi, but would be further along in the spectrum past groups like the Dagoyan Order, as they just wanted to contemplate the nature of reality, not use the Force for good or evil, just contemplate the mystery, which they believe would be more revealed to them as they stripped away this filter of a body. They felt that sensory organs led to passion, passion led to distraction, and distraction led to ignorance. And as the individual would move through thoughts of being called to, let's say, practice procreation, or attachments to friends and family, their own ambitions, food cravings, all of this would slowly die down, to the point that the monk could be still for days, as close as they could to pure thought. And a bit of a roast of Tatooine is that it was chosen by them because it was so unimportant, useless, and devoid of any pleasure. Moving from Teth, the Order abandoned their old sites to move into the sandy Outer Rim world not on any galactic maps. I should point out the sense of humor in the Force itself, because it would be the most backwater and unobscure world, no natural resources, nothing of importance to draw people here, and it ended up being the birthplace of the Chosen One, place that his son was hidden, capital of the Hutt Empire for a time, and launching pad for the new Mandalorian movement. As if the Force itself was trolling their monks wanting to stay pure and away from the action, as these dwellings for the complete rejection of the sensory world were both on Teth and Tatooine, seemed to become synonymous with vice, filled with endless base physical pleasures of any kind, palaces to the ego of the Lord, and filled with hedonistic debauchery. When they first arrived on Tatooine with their 6 cargo ships, they sat down right in between the northern Dune Sea and the Great Mesta Plateau to the south. At this time, the locals were just a handful of miners operating out of the small outpost called Anchorhead, and the native Jawas and Tuskens. The site of the eventual palace was just a sort of wagon circle from the cargo spaceships. But as the harsh desert storms ravaged the exposed areas, this led them to dig out some of the first parts of the underground complex. And then the Tusken Raider attacks forced them to erect buildings, repurposing their ships into a fortress, space-rated blast doors for entrances, and large towers to keep an eye out for the raiders. Though a problem at first, the Tuskens did help to keep this area even more remote, as cities did eventually start growing on Tatooine. Settlers avoided this spot for the same reason they chose it, resulting in it being right in between Mos Espa and Mos Eisley. Around the same time, the Ba'omar monks started transitioning into their spider robo-bodies, the ultimate form of enlightenment. A monk would purge themselves of their bad habits, then comforts, other people, then speech and even movement. The only distracting base tethered to this material world was the requirements of water and food. So when a monk was ready, they would finally purge themselves of the body altogether to be a brain automatically maintained in these creepy spider droid bodies. And in the mid-500s BBY, the Tatooine Bureau of Ethnicity and Socialization expert Alcara stumbled upon this monastery filled with monk-made horrors beyond his comprehension. He was on the run from the Tuskens, after just inciting the war between the raiders and settlers, by using his study of the natives to manipulate them into attacking a police station, and then joining the settlers to massacre another tribe. He's the reason for the blood feud between these two groups that would never fully disappear. Well, after doing that, this researcher turned insane warlord took some loyal forces and stormed the monastery, only to find that the monks actually welcomed him in. He was surprised, but they would not interfere in his operations, as Alcara used this as the headquarters of his rule as a sort of proto-daimyo, taking protection money from the settlers and keeping the peace, and of course creating conflicts whenever necessary. But he also improved the monastery and its surroundings. He cut the roads that lead up to it, and the ones out to the pit of Carkoon, reinforced everything to make this a fortress that could withstand starfighters and tanks, while renovating their tower, adding to the dungeons, and expanding the underground labyrinth. This was all done during the 34-year reign of Alcara, which came to a dramatic and abrupt end with the invasion of the Hutt. Jabba of the powerful Khajiitic, or clan, Desilogic, from the Tior family, aka Jabba the Hutt, would descend on his flotilla and make short work of this dusty regional bully. moving into this monastery fortress as if it was made for him personally. And with the Hutt's affinity for the ancient Ba'omar world Teth, it was the perfect world for this honorable Hutt clan leader. Now that we know the history up to Jabba, let's take a look inside this sprawling complex to see what secrets were packed inside. Starting at the main tower, working our way underground, back up through the main building, and out through the hangar, while also taking a look into the throne and Rancor pit. The surrounding smaller towers are headed with the dome containing various scanning equipment to detect all sorts of vehicles, receive transmissions, but also a lot of weather detection to try and predict the next deadly sandstorms and the rare rain. The main tower was filled with comm equipment, connected to the hyperwave transceiver that allowed Jabba to get in contact with the Hutt Council members all across the galaxy. Below this was an enormous holographic map that could display Tatooine, run simulations of battles or construction projects, or show other worlds of interest to Hutt negotiations. A skywalk connects the tower to the main building, and below this are the ornate stairs that the monks would use for a walking meditation, ascending and descending in complete silence for countless repetitions. This leads down to the power facility that kept the entire complex running, and would have originally been parts of the monks' cargo ships that they arrived in, but was upgraded over the years. A narrow hall takes you to a domed room with a dark purpose, where enlightened Ba'omar would chuck their brothers' brainless bodies into this pit. It's unclear if this section connects to the other chambers, or if they were only accessible from the main building. But if we move over here, we can see the abandoned mine that connects to a lecture hall that was filled with tapestries and frescoes. This was the first structure dug out by the monks, but its long abandonment may show the evolution of their philosophy, as art and intellectual conversation were deemed base distractions, stumbling blocks on the path to the Spideyverse. As this staircase zigzags upward, there's a high-quality spice processing center added by Jabba's goons, and down this main hallway we connect with the layer just below the throne room. This level was filled with all forms of creative torture credits could buy, but right away we see an interesting dynamic of the Underworld HQ. A spice thief was trying to work through a tunnel collapse, and there are several locations where we see people were crazy enough to try and dig a tunnel from some hidden place in the surrounding desert and mountains, and hope to meet up with the sprawling underground complex, and then somehow sneak around and survive long enough to steal things, from Jabba's records, to spice, to really just anything, knowing the long-lived Hutt's love of expensive things, and thinking this underground to be like a massive bank vault. Ironically, there was nothing of value here unless you count the droids. It was just filled with guards and torturers. The only thief we see that got close to anything was this long tunnel that drops right into the abandoned monk room that leads to a pair of triple doors, protecting the Ba'omar regeneration gems. This is the only time we ever hear these gems mentioned. It's unclear how anyone outside of their order could have known what was behind these doors, and likely they expected this was some prized Hutt treasure. No one knows how these gems regenerate or what they are, and it doesn't appear that the thief ever got past these triple defenses. And even weirder is that there is another set of doors here. This is all the info on this mystery, and it seems that Tatooine Jones died before he could try and dig another tunnel from around the doors. Or perhaps this was dug on purpose by the monks as some sort of super high-level esoteric ritual. If it was a thief, it may have been before the introduction of these ground-level sensors that we see right above it, and which during Jabba's day would have surrounded the entire complex. But back to the torture floor, and past the thief that was just eaten alive by the worm burrows that would devour rock and anything in their path. We see the modest quarters of Malakili, the Rancor handler sleeping right behind the antechamber to the main pit, with thick blast-proof doors separating these areas, including the holding pen that could be filled with live prey to be fed to the beast for the amusement of the guests watching from the throne room above. Behind this was a small kitchen, chef quarters, and connected to the guards' quarters. While on the opposite side of the Rancor are these series of prison cells, a staircase connected to the throne room. And this first room was where Chewie and Han were reunited after his carbonite defrost.
Chewie! I can't see, pal!
Across from other sad souls awaiting torture, one having a room full of tubes, the other full of spikes, and a guy being tortured by blood-sucking worms. There was also some unknown tentacle species being held prisoner, and this hallway connected the organic wing to the inorganic, with the large droid processing and torture chamber here. Droids would descend into digital hell via this special droid elevator from the throne room, all managed by EV-99 and 8D8. Just a note, C-3PO and R2 appear to have taken the stairs, either the first round of torture or some clever stalling. This repair room allowed you to resurrect a droid for more torture, being denied even the escape of death, and this was important for getting a scrap droid back online. This chamber was allocated to a group of Jawa outcasts, which was a perfect integration as they could make use of the droids 99 no longer needed, while the Jawas could provide him with rare parts or capture new droids, with that precious information waiting to be tortured out of their circuits. It was in this Jawa wing that C-3PO was fitted with a restraining bolt, and just to meet the power requirements of all this droid activity, there was a dedicated generator block right here. Coming up these stairs, we end up at the throne room, the main event of this monastery turned fortress palace, and the only floor most guests would ever see. To get to the throne room, most would start their journey at the enormous blast door portcullis, greeted by the TT-8L droids scanning and interrogating you, and if you passed, you would usually be met by a Ba'omar monk spider. Jabba loved these things, appealing to his dark sense of humor, and when he took over, the monks were fine with the new lord, and he liked that they set the tone for the menagerie of twisted curiosities that awaited you. The Major Domo would be quick to intercept the guests, coming up via his personal elevator, and they would guide the guests down the steps.
They wanna wonder.
This area would normally be controlled by guards and droids, but eventually you would come up to the final set of stairs, past the wind chimes imported from the Hutt playground world Nar Shaddaa, and behind this wall was an ancient and abandoned pipe organ. Like the frescoes and tapestries, music was abandoned by the later monks as well. While there was a more discreet back staircase preferred by VIPs to shuttle in private entertainers and bounty hunters. This wall was lined with tables, each nook having its own spice station, and this was a pretty universal setup for dens like this, with a similar layout used in the Pikes designs over on Obadiah. There was almost always a lineup of singers, dancers, and Max Rebo's band was in residency here indefinitely, signing a lifetime contract with the Hutt. The center of the room contained the grill-covered trapdoor to the Rancor, and finally we arrive at the Hutt's throne, surrounded by guards and attendants, a supply of his favorite delicacy, live Klatooine patty frogs, and a never-ending supply of spice, while behind him there was always something roasting on a spit. Remember, this structure was intended to be a device to strip away the sensory experience, no input from the physical world, and now it revolves around a being that set himself up to be supplied with a non-stop stimulus to each and every organ. Pretty visuals for the eyes, the best musicians for the ears, drugs to keep the mind distracted, food shoved in his face, and the smell of the next meal slow roasting right behind him. The musician stage would be to this area to the right, with the enormous power drums covered in skins that just gave it a primitive look, while the wall was adorned with the great exotic beasts Jabba had killed on his orders, like the Tauntaun, Jerba, and eventually Solo. While this area was the green room for the band, with Jabba's private elevator, which was rated to ship vehicles, located right back here. If we move up through the floors, there are these larger open areas for hosting parties, mud baths, assorted spice dens, and lounges, with the equivalent of a fondue station but with these frogs, so that he could impress the entire Hutt council in this area, with this spot having the guest quarters and palatial apartments. This cutaway gives us a good look at the grid of deflector shields that completely encircle the main building. This, on top of just how thick the walls are, the parts are from starships, and that Jabba would most often dwell deep underground, and you could see why you could not simply blow it away with some gunship. Maybe an orbital bombardment could do it over time, but I kinda doubt that it, or even a nuclear blast, would easily kill Jabba if he was down in his throne room. Knowing that these were heavily shielded, and most would have intel that showed some bombardment was pointless, the building focused on intercepting potential fighters or some moisture farm or rebellion showing up in vehicles. So in between these rounded, shielded sections, there is an open-air gun deck, full 360-degree cover while the overhang makes sure you can't get it from above, and the rounded piece below is extra reinforcement for incoming attacks. Even seen on Nal Hutt, their centuries of being uncontested and surrounded by guards actually made them and their guests too comfortable. So while you couldn't just blast the palace apart with an X-Wing or Mandalorian commerce class, you could just fight or sneak your way in. The guards were good against your local farmers, and no other crime syndicate would dare take on the Hutt Council's wrath. But if you were outside that underworld framework, like Maul or Luke, you could take advantage of this. It is funny to think about how the main space above the entrance is the remnant of the meditation cells, little rooms like prison cells that the monks would use for sensory deprivation. There had to be at least 100 if not hundreds of monks at one point. They did need 6 cargo ships to move their entire cult here, and it isn't said for sure, but I would imagine that many of the spider droids would dwell in here, occasionally coming out to explore the rest of the palace and surrounding grounds, using this external narrow path that leads out from this area. Relics of their once appreciation for art was seen in this room with large prayer flags on a rotating wheel, which served the practical purpose of catching the wind and draft from temperature differentials from the open area, hot air and cold air mixing causing the spinning of this wheel and turning the prayer flags into a giant fan. Cooling vanes and more advanced air conditioning systems were eventually placed in the peak of the cupola, which also housed more maintenance areas for that Jawa clan, and a special hydroponics garden filled with genetically modified foods for Jabba. There were strains and types of food that one could only get in the illustrious Jabba's desert palace, something that would have made him the talk of the Hutt underworld, especially if you could be invited to a yacht party to visit the Sarlacc. It might seem weird that a swamp-loving Hutt would take up residence in the desert, but understanding how much of a fortress this was, that it was plenty cool down below, and in the hub of Outer Rim oddities like the brain jar spiders and tentacled Sarlacc, while being one of the main worlds of the Spice Triangle, now it all makes more sense. Visitors could land in the large open area outside the hangar, while VIPs in Jabba's own vessels were behind another capital ship-rated blast door. Behind it we find the Katana, and later the Slave One, but it would also house the Bantha II cargo skiffs. When not shuttling prisoners to Sarlacc execution, these were normally used to collect loot from the town or carry the carcasses of hunted game, with the pens for live game and storage rooms lining the entire hangar area, along another large kitchen. If you were creative, you could find a place where the Hutts got lazy on defense against assaults by foot. Fennec would make use of a sewer drain. This is a less glamorous but practical and impressive feature of this palace, as this system is under most of the palace, connecting to the many bathrooms and covered by grates so that waste or blood from the latest confrontation could be easily hosed down right through the floor, into the sewer system flowing out below. An outrageously wasteful and ostentatious display of wealth and power here on Tatooine, where farming moisture out of the air was a thing, and the settlers were forced to pay a water tax to the Great Jabba. Rumors of it being used like this must have driven a farmer to daydream of killing that green alien slug. Besides this, there was another security issue that Fett will surely be upset about when he finds a secret Jawa tunnel they dug out to more conveniently connect them to the other palace quarters and the massive junk pile that built up over the years. Other clans would meet up here and trade, so who knows how much free reign the Jawas have over the palace. Surely to the other clans, this was not Jabba's, but Jawa's palace. After Jabba's death, there was a short civil war, with Bib Fortuna ending up on top, only to reign for a few years before Jabba would finally kill him. As the new daimyo, Fett would seek to rule Tatooine with a different style. And although that's going to be more difficult at the start, I'm sure the long-oppressed denizens of Tatooine will come to embrace their new leader. Anything was better than the sadists like the original researcher Okara, and Jabba and Bib. So that's it for the breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. There are accounts of the spider droid monks being used by Jabba to take out some of his opponents. If you got into this droid through monkhood, they claimed you could develop a telepathy, proof that they had gotten themselves into the pure mind plane of existence. But they also knew that if one was not ready, this experience would be a kind of horrific torture unlike anything else in the galaxy, like phantom limb for the entire body, over all your senses, as you were conscious and thinking, yet stuck in the black void, no telepathy to communicate with others, and these jars seemed to keep you alive for hundreds of years. Jabbas Palace was originally going to be on this world's Slicemon, whose concept art was then used for Lothal. Warts and Romp Rats were a thief's best friend. You could release them to set off the ground sensors, seeing if the guards ever responded or if they were paying attention, and if they were, you could just keep releasing them until they stopped checking. In the Clone Wars animated movie, you can see some of the Jawa camps, potentially a reference to the trade mentioned in the cross-section, which comes from the Complete Cross-Sections books, while other details come from the guidebook Secret of Tatooine, Inside the World of Star Wars, and in the X-Wing Rogue Squadron Handbook comics, we saw that Legends Bib Fortuna was disembodied by these monks, though his account does not seem filled with disembodied torture. In this cross-section, it has the throne room about 8 stories down, which is awesome in terms of being a real bunker to protect against a mobster warlord like Jabba, but it doesn't mesh with just about any other depiction. There is light seen pouring in, and it really seems like the throne room is just down the hall from the entrance and about 1 story down, which is how it is in the Battlefront games, and implied in the Book of Boba and the Clone Wars. You can see the light from the open door from the throne room. So as cool as I think it is for him to be deep underground, kind of ignored that detail from the cross-section. Symbolically, it's neat that Jabba was the gluttonous, self-indulgent, no-moral slob that dwelled underground in the dank, dark cave. But Boba, the man of virtue, sacrifice, and vision, has taken up dwelling in some upper part of the complex, with the open air blowing through, a much more fresh and light feel. But on that note, I cannot make any sense of where this back-to-chamber/armor room is. It looks like they're implying it's in this tall tower, but even if it was in the main building, it doesn't explain how Chrysanthemum could roll down one flight of stairs from the back to room and end up right in the throne room. It doesn't make sense no matter what building they were in. Now what Jabba, definitely Bib Fortuna, and even Boba had in common was that they made good use of their cooking droid staff and never-ending supply of delicious dishes, having it sourced and conveniently brought to them from all over the galaxy. You may not be the daimyo of Tatooine, but most important of all, remember, one man's enlightenment is another Hutt's creepy decoration, and the Force will be with you, always.
They did not surrender even after their patron was killed. They were captured alive as a tribute to you, Lord Fett.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the pig lizards, the Gamorrean species, that came to be synonymous with Hutt security. We'll look at their world, break down their biology, culture, intense mating rituals, and religion, and see how they impacted galactic history. The story starts at grid coordinates T14 on the planet Gamor in the Outer Rim, just outside of Hutt space, and along the treeless trade route. A day was 28 hours and a year 280 days, with a Type 1 atmosphere breathable to most species. It was a very Earth-like planet with mostly temperate climate and a range of everything from mountains to jungles and plains, but with heavy rains over most of the planet year-round. The Gamorreans would rise to be the dominant species here on this world, fighting to survive alongside various low-intelligent primates like the Quizzer, algark stalks which are carnivorous fungus that could eat a Gamorrean, and even crawling mushrooms called snorooks, which would move along the jungle floors in packs of 5 to even 30. The Gamorreans would make most large beasts go extinct, and they were constantly trying to kill off the larger Quizzer primates, which would always steal foods and metals from their cities. And this hunting of large game made it so that almost all wildlife on Gamor, besides the Gamorreans, were all under 1 meter tall. There were some domesticated beasts of burden, and odd things like morts, which were these furry bloodsuckers. The wild ones would swarm targets and drain a prey's blood until it died. But domesticated, they were something of a status symbol, giving off a quote Swedish stink and providing a mild anesthetic feeling. And watch beasts, which had temperaments like rancors, and that they would bond to their owner in a way that made them affectionate to one person, but murderous to any perceived threat. And a bit larger than dogs, they developed alongside the earliest Gamorrean societies, aiding in hunting and acting as guards, with the Gamorrean diet consisting mostly of eating fungus, which they would maintain by being shepherds of large herds of crawling shrooms, while their drink was mostly just water and Potwa beer. Though that civilization would never grow out of a feudal warring clan phase, and it was said that pre-contact history was so convoluted with so much backstabbing and clan fracturing that historians have never made a coherent history of these people. First contact would come around 5000 BBY, and as soon as the alien ship set down on this new world, the crews only survived for a couple days before they were torn apart, and only lasted that long because the 5 clans were busy fighting each other, all trying to get the chance to be the one to kill this new exotic prey. This alien hunt was repeated 6 times before the trade companies sent their own private military, which conquered large areas of Gamor and forced them to open up peaceful trade. For the next 1,000 years, they would be examined by Coruscanti biologists and researchers, and the modern Gamorrean stood 1.8 meters or about 6 feet tall, with a pair of thick horns on the head, large tusks, and overall humanoid appearance, but with much greater muscle density and overall strength. Most are green, but females would vary more in tones of brown, pink, yellow, and even a very rare white pigmentation, while eyes could be yellow, blue, black, or brown. And there were never any stereotypes based on these colors, but there were superstitions across different clans relating to the types of splotches or birthmarks. Most were stocky, but there were your occasional lean Gamorreans, while they would never stray away from their traditional garb, almost always seen in leather clothing with some fur and simple steel armor, called Mahunk Gafa, which was crafted from the spoils of war. They even tried to hold on to their old weapons, mostly the enormous battle axes called the Argarok, that combined with their superhuman strength could easily cleave through most forms of armor. And they would also use swords and maces, though never throughout their entire history, even past the Imperial era, no clan would taint their honor by using long-range weapons like blasters and slug throwers. This high level of cowardice would inspire an alliance of other clans to rise up and make your line go extinct. When these people were cataloged, one of the first hurdles was their language, which was comprised of a series of squeals, oinks, and grunts, And once it was understood by offworlders, they were shocked both at how simple it was, having no ability for high concepts like philosophy, poetry, or literature, but somehow they could understand complex alien languages, and were smart enough to tell when other aliens were aware of how simple-minded and average they were. Like we see in an exchange with a Gamorrean mercenary that left home, only to be made fun of by the hyper-intelligent Geonosian. Gamorreans could not speak Basic due to physical limitations in their voice boxes, but there was the case of Vort Sabinring, nicknamed Piggy, that operated as a New Republic pilot, and was genetically modified to have an extremely high IQ, and surgically augmented with a vocoder that would translate his language into Basic for his squad mates, working similar to what we saw with Mach Shays on Tatooine.
It was Jabba the Hutt's throne.
As the technologically superior offworlders kept working with these people, they found their clans were matriarchal, led by a governing body called the Council of Matrons. The women made the ultimate decisions of alliances and who to go to war with, while the males were trained solely in combat and weaponry from the time of childhood, usually seeing their first war in adolescence. The women would be raised to be hunters, trade, and craft weapons, prepping all through the year for the glorious war season, which was during the best time of the year from spring through fall, where they would launch campaigns on their clan neighbors. Interestingly, one was not considered a coward if the enemy force was overwhelmingly powerful. They could run away squealing just fine. But if the enemy was equal or the challenge was reasonable and they fled, then their comrades would rip them apart in a brutal purging of the coward from their ranks. If they won, all the loot was given to the matrons and dispersed amongst the women. But the greatest warriors had the pick of the piggy litter, being able to mate with whichever unmarried females they wanted. Researchers noted that, like many species, this system accelerated the effects of natural selection, as the weakest warriors died in battle, and then the weaker amongst the survivors bred the least. And their birth rate of males to females was either the original cause of this or influenced by this practice, or a bit of both, as the birth rate across all clans averaged a ratio of 20 males born to every 1 female, though there appear to be no stats for the average lifespan. But we do know that your average clan would be about 20 sows and 50 boars, with litters being 3 to 9 Gamorrean lets, with an average female having 12 husbands over the span of her life, most of them dying in combat. When the traders and their mercs saw these wars firsthand, they scrambled to train the best of them into bounty hunters and mercenaries, but it doesn't seem like this interference by aliens robbed the gene pool of the best males, as they would at least make conjugal visits back home, and were said to be surprisingly affectionate to their children and spouse. Although to offworlders, their methods seemed brutal. Tickling fights with kids turned into snout-breaking blows, and it was a known thing that a kind of, let's say, bedroom toy was smelling salts, as a roll in the hay with these pigs usually involved the male knocking the female unconscious, universally seen as, quote, a prelude to mating, and he would use the salts to wake her up for round 2. It also mentions, quote, if this is the intention, implying that there were plenty of times that he would knock her out for non-sexual reasons. Though I should note, throughout mating season, they were known to be constantly supplying their sows with beautiful flowers. Males would be split up into 4 classes: warlords, clan boars, tuskers, and veterans. Warlords were married to the matrons, while the boars married the sows under her. Tuskers were not wealthy enough to marry, and veterans could be married or unmarried, and were the only ones that would stay behind with the women during war, as they were some way injured and too old for combat. All of these ranks had corresponding levels of those fur leeches on their body, kind of like a jewelry, while actual trade was conducted in precious metals, which males could only win through gambling or looting during war. And I'll try and show respect to their culture by pronouncing this name as close as I can in their native tongue, but females could achieve the title of Gweek, which signified personal preference by the matron, usually gained by amassing a large amount of tuskers that lived on her land, managing it and growing her prosperity in a strange form of simp slavery. But as long as they could visit their families, these warriors jumped at the opportunity to fight wars across the galaxy, with all sorts of high-tech weaponry and against all kinds of new enemies. Some were so excited to fly off in some spacefaring warship that they begged to fight, without the concept of payment, and many companies were all too happy to take on essentially Gamorrean war slaves. Though over time a contract became standard, even then they insisted that either the employer or representative must choose to physically fight them or one of their clanmates. This is the only way to tell if the employer was properly strong, and the fight wasn't supposed to be to the death, but they would draw blood and then sign a contract in that blood. A major inconvenience in a digital age with contracts signed via holo and stored across a HoloNet cloud. Surely the Offworlders rolled their eyes, but did comply with this demand just to work with these warriors. This practice was still in place when Jabba sent Han Solo and Chewie to contract some guards for his palace. Luckily, a Nikto they were working with was eager to fight a pig lizard, and jumped in for them, eventually getting that bloody signature. But even in the modern age, spread out through the stars, old clan rivalries still bubbled up in far-off space stations. Even if they were now under the same alien employer, it was known that Gamorrean clan fights could still explode here. Another costly annoyance that proves they must have been worth the trouble. And of course, the more seasoned merc companies knew to do a full vetting of their new hires, understanding the culture and clan history, so that over the years different employers became locked in with certain clans, and essentially were just extensions of the clans back home. Over the millennia, they would acquire starships of their own and colonize the world Pazab. And these ships were known to be incredibly Spartan, the bare bones with few amenities, though heavily shielded and packed with powerful cannons and torpedoes. But it seems like they did realize their place in the galaxy. Perhaps the matriarch was still in control of the spacefaring phase and made sure they did not turn their war-loving tendencies towards other more advanced species. Because as much as they liked a good fight, an orbital bombardment would have rendered them the same fate they delivered to countless extinct beasts on their homeworld. So there were no incidents of Gamorreans using their spaceships for aggression. A few times on defense against your random pirates, but that's about it. And with more credits and access to the galactic market, they bought all sorts of new weapons, but these were still just more advanced vibro weapons. At no point in their history would they ever have a unified world government or ruling body for their colonies, so they never had seats in anything like the Republic, CIS, or later governments. Their cities became larger and more complex, but never more advanced than mud brick buildings, with towers, open markets, and almost always a thick surrounding wall. Their religious beliefs would morph slightly as they moved into these cities, but they never abandoned their animalistic belief system, seeing everything on Gamora as having some sort of spirit, whether it be animals, plants, rocks, or water. And this was part of the reason for bringing flowers to your wife. The more flower spirits she possessed, the more supernatural help she would have at getting pregnant. While they came to care less about nature spirits while in the city, there was still a reference for legendary heroes whose spirit was still said to be moving across the battlefronts on Gamor. And they would do pilgrimages to larger trees and fungi whose spirits could be communed with. There was a strange logic to this system, as a tree spirit would be broken down into little parts and then dwell in your house when you built with its branches, though the forest and mountains could strike back in the form of dropping branches on you or causing giant mudslides. Sea and ocean spirits were too large and powerful to ever trust, and travel by water was to be avoided at all costs. But though less concerned with nature spirits, in the city you had to worry about the souls of slain enemies haunting you, the ancestors of your disgruntled neighbor. But at least during a siege, it was believed that with each of your piggy comrades killed in defense, you could take comfort in knowing that their soul was now supercharging the defenses of the city in the afterlife, or the parallel life, as war was simultaneously fought on both planes of existence. One way to keep peace was that if all parties involved, be they two families or two warring tribes, if they agreed that somebody was a cowardly murderer, they would be killed within the same day, as the spirit of a wrongly murdered person wandering Gamor was the most feared thing in the supernatural realm. Though of course there had to be times when this was compounded by wrongly killing an innocent suspect. All of this combination of mysticism and war-loving made the Sith love these people. During the time of the Empire, they often worked with them, as they were willing to be slaves to see combat and eventually took their own slaves, the Sith letting them launch Viking-like raids with their high-tech ships and weapons, being so successful that other slavers hired them. And remember, many of these men were actually slaves under some Sal back home. Some real slaveception going on. And although they were not mentioned by name, I'd assume that this brought them into the circle of the once powerful Zygerian Empire.
For thousands of years, Zygeria supplied slave labor to the galaxy.
And though for the ladies, life back home was pretty sweet, some lower-ranking females, or just adventurous ones, would choose to leave home as well, often fulfilling the high-paying jobs and entertainment of the adult nature, particularly admired by the Celestins, giving a whole new meaning to the term belly dancer. While on the opposite end, there was a colony of nuns formed on the planet Ga-Av-Arun, and these nuns were a small group of Force-sensitive Gamorreans. This may be because they were exiled, as there's not really a lot of mention of Force use amongst these people, and only a short cryptic mention of the Gamorreans' hatred for all forms of magic. No explanation of what that means, and they were okay with spiritual warfare, but this combat magic was something else. and matrons were known to commune with the spirits of their previous matron, but that was still a person, not the all-binding, impersonal force. But their most famous use would be under the service of Hutt lords. They were a staple of Hutt security since the time of the Old Republic and up through Jabba, mostly because of their intimidating stature and muscle to back it up. But even better was how cheap you can get one of the low-status males, who were almost immune to bribery because of their culture of honor and war. Solo and Chewie would bring back 12 guards to Jabbas Palace on Tatooine, and the Slug ordered some thugs to attack them, which was kinda Jabba's MO, something he did to new bounty hunters like Black Chrysanthemum as well, and the 9 Gamorreans that survived were added to the security detail, with these two being Captain Ortug and Gartog, the latter being considered the dumbest guard in the entire palace. It is unclear, but possible that these are the same two that were left alive during Bib Fortuna's reign and into the service of Boba. May their souls continue to defend Boba in this spirit life. So that's it for the history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. They're said to weigh 100 kilograms, which is only 220 pounds, but it seems to me like they would weigh a lot more. But what is interesting is that we have stats like their average body temperature was 40.56 degrees Celsius or 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and their verbal tones ranged from 50 to 13,000 hertz. During the Clone Wars, we see one of the only times that a Gamorrean was not some sort of warrior, with one being a clown with the Prego Circus. Besides being guards, many would be the staple of underground and professional fighting rings, so it's funny to think that Black Chrysanthemum's rise to the top would have him killing countless numbers of them. In the canon comic series Vader's Castle, there's a ridiculous story that I didn't feel like I should include in the main breakdown, but it is canon. But I feel like the vibe of these comics was to be over the top and ridiculous, so don't judge them for being that, that's what they were going for. It has stories like Count Dooku becoming a vampire, and I'm not sure if I should include that in his eventual complete life story. So in this same series, there's a part where a Tarkin Initiative mad scientist that hated Vader created a serum that could be injected, and when a certain frequency was played, the victim's DNA would rapidly transform them into a Gamorrean, and then it could be transferred to another person just by touch. When Vader heard this, he wasn't worried, with his suit and all, but he hoped to use this against the Rebel Alliance. But the plan didn't pan out, and so he turned the creator into a piggy, and let him be ripped apart by his own creations. And this one's a legend story, which I didn't know what to do with, but Gork and Thok were brothers that were guards in Jabbas Palace, who had, quote, magic powers, being able to shoot fire from their mouths, which was said to be some sort of force power. The earliest sketches of them were by Ralph McQuarrie, who did most of the beautiful concept art you've seen, and it had them being a sort of lizard bear thing, and later Joe Johnston formed them into being more pig-like. They were to have no clothing on their upper body, but the seams of the costume were too obvious, so leather and metal was added to cover it all up. And while on set, they were referred to as the Pig Guards. If you're in the Tatooine sun, you're gonna need some stylish shades. And if you think that Gamorrean guard is winking at you, you might need some new glasses. But most important of all, remember, make sure you understand the other person's culture first. Not everyone sees smelling salts and a concussion as an aphrodisiac, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Nikto species, including the many subspecies, and their complete history, including notable Niktos from the time of the Old Republic, through into the Chaos era after the fall of the Empire, and into the time of the New Republic and First Order. One of these figures is Rin Riven Dai, the Nikto that made a cartel so large Leia Organa feared that he had replaced Jabba and the Hutt clans, being the new lord of the underworld.
And had Tarkin been born a Nikto, he would have been exactly like Rin Riven. He's no thug, Leia decided. He's much more dangerous than that. And his goals will be broader than any mere spice cartel. Rin Riven leaned forward, his elbows on the table, hands clasped together as though he were beseeching her.
We honor you, Hutt Slayer. We will always honor you for ridding the galaxy of Jabba the Hutt.
Let's head back to the grid coordinates S9 in the Outer Rim, to the Nikto homeworld of Kintan, neighboring Boz Pity and Tatooine, and right on the edges of Hutt space, within the Kintan system, containing a single sun and no other planets, though Kintan itself did have 3 moons. A day would be 32 hours and a year 412 days, with a diameter of 12,054 kilometers, right around Coruscant, and with the most common Type 1 atmosphere breathable by most species. If you ever want to go down the rabbit hole, the reason why so many planets are suitable to so many other species, and why so many are humanoid in shape, has to do with the Celestials. also known as the architects who helped shape much of the galaxy, and who really need a video of their own. The terrain has locations like the Endless Wastes, which were thousands of miles of inhospitable rocky regions and lava. As Aayla Secura once said as a Padawan visiting Kintan, "River of fire, sand like ground glass. This is not a very pleasant place, Master." Though there were also large seas and forests and swamps, with an overall temperate climate. Some of these lakes appear to be hundreds of times the largest found on Earth, and contained many freshwater predators that made for great fishing. And there were chains of islands in both the seas and lakes that formed archipelagos that would help in the evolutionary divergence of this species, and later we'll see how these were used for great pirate hideouts. These are by far the nicest part of Kintan, though some tourists would make a trip out of heading down into the Canyon of Despair, a canyon made not by water but by lava, the endlessly raging fire river that you could follow up toward the basin of torturous flame which fed the lava and came flowing out from the core of this world. The Canyon of Despair was also fed by the ring of 7 volcanic mountains known as the Burning Moon Range, which was located on the sea but stretched to reach the canyon, and lava flowed out from these and down into the river. This river was then tidally pulled by the interaction of the 3 moons, and every month the path would change slightly, resulting in areas equivalent to dried riverbeds. This intense heating and cooling formed hyperferrofeldspar crystals, which are the natural form of the material you find in skyscrapers and nearly every starship. The windows that are made of transparasteel, glass crystal that was stronger than steel. These crystals were often ground up by the seismic activity in this region, and formed the insanely sharp sand that Aayla was complaining about. Since this region made the air extremely hot, at certain times a year as cooler winds collided with it, there would be intense sandstorms that would send these transparasteel shards flying through the air at hundreds of miles an hour, smoothing down rock features into beautiful pieces of natural art, or painfully sandblasting a person out of existence, eroding their skin, muscle, and bones until they became one with the storm. As you would imagine, nothing lived in these regions, but even the creatures that arose in other regions were extremely hardy. And of all the places, Nikto seemed to have originally evolved around these endless wastes. Omnivores that hunted prey and had protection in the form of thick, leathery skin, and these horns that lined their face. Their teeth were like humans, as well as their eyes, though the eyes had a hard protective membrane that could protect them from sandstorms, and even outside of the lava riverbeds, just your normal sandstorm was intense. Which is why these tubes on the side of the neck that were used for breathing also have a protective membrane that they could open or close at will, like flaring your nostrils. And like how our nose hairs help to filter, these were long filtration tubes that could be used when there was too much debris being kicked up, and also work to trap moisture that could then be reabsorbed into the body. They have very few facial muscles compared to humans, and the only real emotions you can detect on their face is when they smooth out these flaps, a sign of happiness like a smile. But with this usually stiff face, scary row of horns, and a membrane over their eye making them dull, most other species thought they were either mean, dumb, or both. Low intelligence being erroneously inferred just by the dim look in their eyes, and even the Jedi Order knew that this species was particularly susceptible to Jedi mind tricks. And as for the rest of their body, it is fairly human, just with claws and these hard knuckles. Now keep in mind that this is not what the original Nikto species look like. That was lost to time, but this is the closest thing we have left. It may sound strange, but in a way the original species is extinct and is now spread into 6 different subspecies after the Midweshu Nova incident. If you watched our Nal Hutt video, you saw how a star-going supernova cut off a major hyperroute that ended the rivalry between Coruscant and the Hutt world. No longer competing for legal business, Coruscant would be the hub of everything legit, while the Hutts would dominate all illegal business. While around 26,000 BBY, the star Midweshu was in the system neighboring Kintan, and when it went nova, it didn't just bathe this world in radiation. It was more like a flood that would forever change organic life on this planet. Everything from spine dragons that now rivaled kraits, to mammoth-like tusk beasts that became even more violent, though the Nikto would hunt them down to extinction and cherish ceremonial weapons made from their ivory and bones. But the Nikto would be forever altered as well, a fast forward of evolution that rapidly diverged the species depending on what region they were located in, taking what would have developed over millions of years and shrinking it down to a few thousand. Though they never diverged so much as to prevent interbreeding, and it was found that mixed offspring would take on 93% of the traits from a single parent, with some very small notes from the other. The Red Nikto, or Kajansa Nikto, were the most common, and had the greatest number of traits found in all the other subspecies, leading to the conclusion that they were the least mutated. Their skin color and features were already adapted for the Wanshok, or endless waste deserts, The Kadasa Nikto, or Green Nikto, were living in the coastal forest regions. Without the harsh sandstorms, we see that the breathing filter tubes on the side of the head are gone. The horns and flaps around the mouth have flattened out, and a nose emerged from a region that was already protruding. Keep in mind, the Celestials formed many species off of a single genetic template, so similar to how we share genes with other animals, and embryos have structures that diverge into specification for their species. We will see how things like the typical nose and ears found in species from human to Chiss do emerge out of this shared DNA being hit by that radiation flood. And less drastic changes were the narrowing and lengthening of the fingers to help them better climb trees.
Everyone, meet Uplock!
The Esrasal Nikto seem like they're aquatic with these fins, but that prefix in their language actually means mountain, their gray skin helping them blend into their stone surroundings, and they would completely lose the expression of tubes and horns, having a softer skin being away from the sandstorms. And in the misty mountains, this is where those facial fins come in, as these Nikto would see the greatest variance in temperature, from blazing hot sun beating down on them during the day, and cool mountain air at night. And somehow these flaps are also said to improve their hearing. The Glusa Nikto, or Pale Niktos, were an in-between of those last two, having a brown of horns and short fins along the cheeks, and were found in the Glus Elta Islands, and some xenobiologists argue that they emerged from breeding between the mountain and forest ones, but it seems unlikely that these two groups would meet enough to overcome the 93% genetic similarity to one parent. The Mashento Su Nikto, or Southern Nikto, don't really have any dramatic distinctions, looking closer to the red, but do seem to lose most of their horns, the skin is slightly smoother, and the breathing tubes point upward around the neck and back of the head. But in all other ways, they are said to be the most similar to the red, with their skin color actually ranging from white to yellowish orange. And in the final subspecies, perhaps the most divergent, were the Numal Elrul. Thinking back to the shared genes between humans and fish, the mutations on these presumably coastal clans, who now had organs that could extract oxygen from water like gills, while still retaining their lungs to breathe above water, and their leathery skin developed into a sort of scales, which were in a bluish-green color, further hinting that they were closer to the coastal forest green Niktos. They were so rare that even most other Niktos thought they were just a legend, so the only off-worlders that would have ever seen them would be xenobiologists. Below the waves, they would become prey to other mutated species, like the horned trog whale. Now, with all that explained, I do want to take a small step backwards. In the thousands of years before the star went nova, these people had developed to fight fierce beasts, leading them all to have intense warriors at the core of their society. Even the earliest clans came together in order to hunt and build defenses against these monsters, and then against the rival subspecies clans. City-states became countries, and eventually there was a relative peace across the world as civilization built up on the bones of beasts that were now made extinct, no longer a threat to Nikto society. They developed atomic power, but all this time these mutations are still having an effect, causing monsters to emerge from the depths and other unexplored areas of the world. With their high tech, they destroyed their environment to the point of hurting their biosphere globally, leading to the first series of world wars. It would be during the Fourth Planetary War that the Midweshu Nova was identified as the source of all these mutations, the cause of their own subspecies, and this endless stream of monsters that roamed their world. Scientists across the globe all reached the same conclusion, and now saw this blast of radiation as the great shaper of their world, and even responsible for the mutation that changed the Nikto from unthinking lizards to the intelligent creatures they were today. Imagine the turmoil this species was undergoing, still undergoing the effects of mutations during World War IV, all different subspecies using atomic weaponry against each other and against the swarms of things like dragon beasts. But actually, out of all the fear and hatred this would induce, an odd source of unity also sprung up. A sort of intersection of scientism and mysticism. Astronomers are at the core of a new kind of faith that would come to be known as the Cult of Midweshu. This happening about 1,000 years before the formation of the Republic. They deified the star, as it was actually shaping their species, and in their eyes acting like a ball of purifying flame, setting their species on the path to become Uber-Niktos, the ultimate form of their people to strive towards. The cult took in members from each of the subspecies, not discriminating against subspecies in general, but they did implement a form of eugenics, eliminating those who were not taking well to the mutations, and also religious inquisitions to purge all those whose minds were wicked, meaning they didn't agree with the cult. To the cult leaders, they were all to look to the celestial spirit for guidance on how to live their life, a sort of metaphysics applied to the real astronomy and evolution. And since these both revealed themselves during the Fourth War, and inflicted horrible pain on the weak while strengthening those that could handle the mutations. The leaders of these inquisitions would kill off thousands to purify their species and please the Star God. Those that knew they would be deemed impure tried to hide out in remote regions, and cult members would work their way up to leadership positions in all the world governments, making the High Priest astronomers the de facto leaders of the Nikto. An intense reign of terror would last for 30 years, but keep in mind that like most large-scale histories with sentient beings, this looks insane and horrifying. But they were literally being altered at a rate that would take millions of years. The changes were not just on the outside, but also within their brains and presumably minds. And they were already 4 world wars deep at this point. I think all things considered, it's astonishing that they achieved stability in 30 years, and that they did not kill each other down to a single subspecies or just total extinction. Because in a weird way, that cult leadership did bring global peace, seeing these mutations as a good thing. And as dark as it is, the scientist priests killing off those that were not taking to the mutations may have helped to keep each of the subspecies healthier. This theo-scientocracy would rule for hundreds of years, before they ran into a much larger species, the Hutts. Their empire was expanding to conquer what would become known as Hutt space, and the slugs were gobbling up whole systems every decade. Their success came at the combination of having no moral restrictions, lifespans of 1,000 years, and monopolizing on the markets that provided the vice to the shorter-lived and easy-to-manipulate species. Hutt ships would descend on Kintan in 25,130 BBY, bringing with them Nikto neighbors like the Klatunians and Vodrans, who had already long been conquered and used as the muscle for the cartels. But the Hutt Chiraba was shocked to see how technologically advanced the Nikto were, and weirded out by their one-world cult government. Chiraba retreated to space for time while the agents collected intel from the average citizens and tried to process the Nikto culture. Chiraba noticed that at this point, the commoner more feared the cult and weren't necessarily raving lunatics, or should I say novatics? But the Hutt thought that she might be able to capture the love of the people and destroy the cult all in one move. A single orbital bombardment on the headquarters of the cult government. It would only take a few hours, and combined with messengers that came in peace, not firing a single bolt, but telling the commoner that they had no aims on ruling the Nikto, they just felt the natives should be able to make their own free choice to partake in the greater galactic community. And with that, the Hutt ships retreated back into space. As the world was consumed in revolution that destroyed the cult government centers, it appeared the Nikto implemented some sort of representative government, and voluntarily tied their fates to the Hutts, with Chiraba acting as their friendly guardian in this big, confusing cosmos. But by the next 30 years, we would see the Hutts fighting their only real rival, Zim the Despot. During this war, the Nikto were watching their freedoms being taken away, as they were guided into their role of warriors for the Hutts. And of course, when some opposed this, the Hutts used the threat of Zim the Despot, who had earned his title for good reason, in order to strike fear into the common Nikto, and accelerated this stripping of their autonomy until they signed the Treaty of Vontor. Cossack the Hutt had implemented this slow dictatorship tactic across several other species, and this treaty put the Klatunians, Nikto, Vodrans, and Weequay into a permanent serfdom to their slug lords. But of all these races, it would be the Nikto berserkers that would find themselves remembered in legendary tales, remembering the Battle of Vontor, where Zim and his warbots were thoroughly defeated. And though the Niktos were the war heroes, Hutt space was now unquestionably for the Hutts alone. The entire Nikto species would be seen as a pool of warriors, and this relationship did bring material wealth to their homeworld, at the cost of their autonomy. And the next 20,000 plus years would see Niktos guarding all level of Hutt operations, from security at spice mines, to getting into shootouts with pirates, carrying out assassinations, and acting as palace guards. Though it is interesting to note that they did retain their language, also called Nikto, while being fluent in Huttese and Basic. Not too shabby for a species seen as dim-witted. While the flame of the cult would never be fully extinguished, with some cultists attempting an assassination on Chiraba, it would become more concentrated off-world in the Sisar run. Though it would get as low as 100 members galaxy-wide, there was a Kajansa Nikto comically nicknamed Jasper McKnives that was around even as late as the Clone Wars, seeing his killings in the gladiatorial ring as blood offerings to Medweshu. And they were still on the radar of the Republic, as Hutt officials like DeRossi had to promise that the Hutt cartels could keep the cult in check, while the Jedi didn't fully trust them on this, and did retain records on the cult. But their biggest flare-up was circa 4000 BBY. While the galaxy was dealing with the Great Sith War, the most deadly in recent memory, the Nikto began to question why they were dying by the millions to defend the weak, lazy slugs. The cult made sure to get involved and shape the propaganda and develop paramilitary groups, eventually taking the government centers of power on Kintan. Though the Hutts did not give up easy, nor did they fight on the front lines, using their wealth to send wave after wave of mercenary groups that truly tested the hardy warrior spirit of these people like never before. A war that would see a third of their planetary population dead. Though they did force the Hutts off and had some semblance of autonomy, even while countless millions were still acting as essentially slave warriors for their Hutt lords that they couldn't escape from. And they would stay in continuous use by numerous Hutt clans forever.
This is the destiny of the Hutts. The great Hutt Empire will be restored. We must warn the Hutts. We must.
You will do nothing.
About 50 years later, during the Jedi Civil War, we see Nikto swoop gangs on Taurus, and a whole sector of Nar Shaddaa was known as the Nikto Sector, where at least in theory the area would be owned and operated by a Nikto, and the Hutts wouldn't just dictate what goes on there. An impressive feat for a world that was the Hutt's Coruscant, and the moon right above the Hutt Cartel HQ of Nal Hutt. This area was given to the species in honor of Horath Gendi, a Nikto that saved the life of his Hutt master. When he earned his freedom, he formed a powerful gang in this sector, and this would set the trend for gangs fighting for power over this area, with one of the most powerful to pop up during the Cold War era being the Kintan Kings, who even tried to steal a Republic freighter at one point. During the same Cold War era is when alien researchers would encounter more beasts mutilated by the Nova, like the Kintan Crusher and Strider, which would be immortalized in the game Dejarik. But as those gangs on Taurus grew, the older cult and discipline-loving Sith used their like-minded Mandalorian allies to try and reduce crime in the area by hunting down any Niktos with gang affiliation. Around the same time, we see the cult-loving side of these people popping up, with many of them joining the cult of Kai Sazin, named for a fallen female Zabrak Jedi that got her followers to steal technological devices from both the Sith Empire and Republic storehouses, with the goal of creating an ultrawave transmitter which would give her mastery over the Sith spawns called Rakghouls. There was also the female revolutionary Huttbreaker, who was able to organize smugglers, gunrunners, Mandalorians, and other slavers to turn on their Hutt overlords during their conquest of Makeb. Seeing that the slugs were distracted by war, she was able to lead this small island of freedom, naming the space station Mek Shah after a friend that she lost to Hutt rule. And around this time is when the secret order of the Morgukai warriors was formed. This was a very unique military force, unlike the Mando, Sith, or Jedi. Based on Kintan but mostly active on Taurus, they were similar to the Mandalorians in the way that they would use their martial prowess to be hired out to protect locals, on this world often fighting against the Sith, though unlike Mandos, they were exclusively Nikto. They had a deep hatred for the Force-wielding Jedi and Sith, but not because they were zealots of the cult of Midweshu. They were separate, but they too were described as a death cult. Imperial forces were suffering so many casualties that they hired swarms of Mandalorian mercs, who were particularly incentivized when they discovered that the Morgukai loved to use Cortosis staves, a material that was like Beskar in its resistance to blaster and even lightsabers. So they were seen as prize trophies amongst the Mandos for both their practical purpose, but as proof that you had bested these fierce Nikto warriors. Tython Phom discovered that these Niktos were somehow force-resistant, and though it is never explained how this happened, we can assume that it is either through further mutations or purposeful eugenic breeding and alterations by the cult. As they spread to Nar Shaddaa, they established an impressive temple, which would be raided by Republic forces to free Tython. The state of Nikto society would stay roughly the same for the next 4,000 years, though during the time of the Clone Wars we would see at least 6 Nikto Jedi: Fayek Search, Bat Jul, Asura Set, Jopishi, Makish Shalas, and Amagun Dai. They were all aware of the resurgence of the stain on their species, as the cult was kidnapping aliens in the Sissar Run, usually from commercial ships, and ritually slaughtering them to their star god. This intense flare-up killed so many travelers that the Bureau of Ships and Services issued a warning in this sector, to which local businesses and governments responded by placing bounties to kill any free Nikto. You couldn't kill the ones that were owned by some powerful Hutt lord, but it was open season on anyone else, even if the cultists were just a tiny percentage of their species. All were hunted out of fear of these ritual murders. But these killings would be nowhere near the threat of the Morgukai clones. Even the best archives in the galaxy barely had scraps of intel on this cult, with further confusion caused by the fear towards the Midweshu cult. And when 2 members, Tisir and his son Bok, fought against Quinlan Vos and his Padawan Aayla Secura, they didn't even know that the Cortosis weapons were synonymous with the Morgukai for millennia. They killed Bok's father while taking Bok's hand, and the master of occult knowledge, Count Dooku, contacted him to see if he would be interested in delivering the revenge of the Morgukai. Bok would be the genetic template of a separatist clone army. He was the Jango Fett of the CIS, and their Kamino would be the world's Seleucami. Jedi Master Thome would discover this secret army of Force-resistant Niktos, and after the blockade of Seleucami led to an all-out battle, the Jedi would suffer intense losses in the 5 months of fighting that gave a new meaning to the Clone Wars. With all the Bok-spawn Morgukai being killed when explosives flooded the facility with lava. This symbolism for these religious cult warriors must have been heavy, being both a purifying flame that killed them, and also in the form of a flowing river of flame like the landmark on Kintan. During the Imperial era, Palpatine would place the Morgukai on a long list of illegal religions, and it was believed that their final member was personally killed by Darth Vader. This proud warrior cult coming to an end in a conclave on Kessel, with the one being killed actually considering himself to be an ex-Morgukai, turning away from the crazy cult, whose name was Mikish Shalas. But as you might have expected, there was a small group of them in hiding in some dark nook in the galaxy, as over 100 years later, in 137 ABY, we see one of the cult members in the service of a pirate working alongside Cade Skywalker, this descendant of Vader taking care of this Morgukai as well. As for the normal Niktos in the galaxy, they would fight to get out from under the fat green thumb of the Hutts, but when Leia put an end to the most prominent slug Jabba, it would mark the most free time in living memory, with many Niktos setting up their own swoop gangs across Tatooine, a proud moment even if they were attacked by their ancient enemy, a Mandalorian bounty hunter. But by far the most notable Nikto of this era would be Rin Riven Dai. No weird cults or blind warrior rage. He operated with a cool head and shrewd mind for business. He was 8 years old at the outbreak of the Clone Wars, and by the time of the Empire, he was a small-time spice dealer, feeling the oppressive bulk of his Hutt overlord. Major spoilers for that book I mentioned at the beginning, Bloodline. It really is a great new canon addition, so go ahead and skip this video if you don't want to hear it, but I just want to end on this. Yet he would grow his small group of thugs to a proper cartel, and then explode to run operations that were so large it was said to rival the Hutts at their peak, creating problems for businesses all across the Outer Rim, and especially on Ryloth, where he mastered the slave and spice trade. He shocked people even as cultured as Leia Organa, who observed that he had a noble air of refinement. Not just shocking for a Nikto, but a great change from the gluttonous, stinking slobs like the Hutts. Rin Riven Dai came to her attention in 28 ABY, 6 years before the First Order would reveal itself. During Leia's investigation into this Nikto cartel, she traced its funding back to the Amaxine Warriors, a mysterious paramilitary group, which itself popped out of nowhere with an abundance of credits. The process of following the money eventually showed her the very first bits of evidence at a massive military force hiding in the shadows of the unknown regions that was for some reason pumping credits into organizations that would spread crime and chaos all throughout the New Republic territory. Rin Riven Dai had learned a lot from his Hutt lords, and he hated that he had to make an enemy with the Hutt Slayer Leia, as he tells her that all Nikto love her, not for her work in the rebellion or as a senator, but they know she's the one that killed Jabba the Hutt.
Hutt Slayer.
Rin Riven breathed in genuine reverence.
This is what we call you among ourselves, and it is a far greater title than either senator or princess could ever be.
And she will forever be a Nikto legendary hero, even if Rin Riven had to kill her. Of course, he failed, and it cost him his life, sending the underworld into even more chaos, with the Niktos, Hutts, and crime lords from other species all waging wars to become the new lord of the underworld. Chaos that would inadvertently help the First Order, as their propaganda gained followers in the New Republic territory, who agreed that in order to fix things, you had to have First Order. So that's it for their history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. The logo of the Speeder Gang in the Book of Boba Fett is also seen on Caltho the Hutt. I haven't seen anybody point that out yet, I just noticed this in making this video, so if you have seen other people talk about this or have more info, please comment down below. I plan on making a short video about this next. And I didn't want to include this part from Legends as they were mutually exclusive, but in the year 26 ABY, the Yuuzhan Vong captured Kintan, and 75% of their population was either killed or enslaved. Kintan means grilled meat in Japanese, and a lot of barbecue restaurants come up when you search their homeworld. A lot of this info comes from novels, a ton of comics, the new canon show Resistance, and a lot of reference and guidebooks including The Essential Guide to Warfare, Chronology, Alien Anthology, Lords of Nal Hutt, and Outer Rim Worlds. But most important of all, remember, A cult that combines science and religion is always more terrifying than the sum of its parts. And the Force will be with you. Always.
Men of Ryloth, the time has come to free ourselves!
It's a Kalikori, a revered Twi'lek heirloom, passed from parent to child through generations.
To see what the Empire has done to our world. They plunder our wealth and sell our people into slavery. This ship must burn, for all Ryloth to see.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Twi'lek species, using everything from both canon and legends, understanding their biology, culture, history, and impact on the galaxy. If you learn anything new, please hit the like button to help promote the video on YouTube, and comment any questions you still have or suggestions for future videos, as I at least read every comment and try to respond as much as I can. But with that, let's head back to around 36,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Right away, we are met with a mystery that has never been fully understood. The Rakata were an ancient race that conquered their masters, the Kwa, and established their galaxy-spanning infinite empire. This empire ran on technology that tapped into the dark side of the Force, literally using it as fuel, and also as a means of acquiring personal strength amongst its leaders. One of the rules of the universe is that the Force always strikes back, and they noticed that this uncontrolled drawing on the dark side was leading to defects and degeneracy in their species. Trying to figure out how to beat this, they created an AI called Asha, and put it in charge of a massive factory that could create living beings, using the building blocks of other sentient species that had a connection to the Force to try and figure out why it was that the Rakata were losing their connection.
My children are as numerous as the Rakata once were. I called them Twi'lek, Sabrak, Eshka.
The mystery comes in that the Tho-Yor, the ships from the Force Nexus world of Tython that brought countless Force-sensitive species to Tython, did pick up Twi'leks in the year 36,453 BBY, a time that would have been during the peak of the Rakata's infinite empire, supposedly before they started this experiment with the Shah. So we are left to wonder if the Twi'lek species was actually created by a machine, or if it was just replicated by a Shah, creating a sort of subspecies, with the true original Twi'lek species developing naturally on Ryloth. This is important because this seeming contradiction may actually be the missing link to understand why Twi'leks differ so dramatically. So keep this in mind throughout the rest of their story, a story that starts off with us understanding their biology. The first thing most species notice about these people is their head tails, or leku. In fact, the name that they were called by other species was a conjunction of the galactic basic words twin leku, or Twi'lek. A quick side note here about the pronunciation: Twi'lek, Twi'lek, and Twi'lek are all canonically correct ways to pronounce their species, and you'll even hear members of this species use these different pronunciations. Back to the head tails, this species themselves called them their chun chin, words that in the real language meant left and right. To be completely fluent in Rill or Twi'leki required a whole array of nonverbal cues in the form of almost imperceptible movements of the leku, along with more obvious gestures that meant certain things, like crossing both of the tips twice meant I love you, and there were simple movements similar to the wave of a hand that meant things like hello and goodbye. And it is because of this nonverbal communication aspect of the lekus that we see so many of them wearing a headdress. Though it became a cultural norm to wear some sort of headdress, the headdress was actually developed out of a practice by the slavers, who used them as a sort of muzzle. They figured that the Twi'leks could develop a sort of imperceptible sign language, so the original headdresses would greatly restrict the movement of the head tails. It may be why we can still see some Twi'lek slaves with wrappings that go the entire length of each leku, and why Bib Fortuna seems to go out of his way to not wear one. Bib was a stylish man draped in the finest Ryloth silk, and even wrapping his lek around his shoulder in a way that was considered posh. But he makes sure not to partake in this fashion that was born from the slavery of his people. Now some referred to the leku as brain tails, and why this is more accurate than head tails is that the Twi'lek's brain actually extends into the tails, though the large majority of it served as storing of body fat that was useful during times of famine. Newborns do not have these tails, so their brains and skulls are growing with the leku for those first couple of years, with everything reaching maturity at about the same rate as humans. And this connection to the brain is why you can knock a Twi'lek unconscious by yanking on their leku, something that resulted in countless deaths in cantina brawls, or at the hands of pranksters and other species in densely packed urban environments. And And then there were the cases of head tails being damaged that also resulted in brain damage, and even a cyborg Twi'lek by the name of Rihanna Saren, who had part of her Leku cyberized. I should also mention that they were prehensile, meaning they could use them to grab things, which makes you wonder if there was ever a time in early Twi'lek history, or at least with some common evolutionary ancestor, that they might have used these head tails for balance or an extra pair of limbs to hang from things and swing through the forests or navigate the deep cave systems. Adding on the weirdest note, the cultural aspect of the Leku shape and size that makes them something of a status symbol. While they were culturally developed, complex, and abstract ways that the girth and length of one's Leku was a sign of wealth and power, the less abstract and more blunt fact about it was that these were erogenous zones, places on the body that were sensitive to sexual stimulation, and to both males and females, the bigger the Leku, the sexier, making Coruscant biologists list the Leku as playing a crucial role in sexual selection. To make it even weirder, there was the odd case that some Twi'leks would have 4 Lekus. This does seem to be incredibly rare, but is actually found in one of the most famous members of the species, Orn Free Taa, though I would suspect that his other physical features took away from this great natural endowment. I doubt even with these 4 Lekus that he was anything of a ladies' man. The rest of their biology is very similar to all the other humanoids out there, with a pair of arms, legs, and eyes, and then a nose and a mouth, but their ears do differ. In males it was very similar to humans, but the females had what were called ear cones. Both sexes had blunt teeth, but it became a cultural norm for the men to sharpen them to points. And thanks to the Chiss, who have a sort of heat vision overlay to their eyesight, we find out that the Twi'leks have a higher body temperature than any other humanoid species. Neither sex had body hair except for their eyelashes, which was most likely a very useful adaptation to the harsh sandstorms that could kick up on Ryloth. They did not have eyebrows, though some females would paint them on or get eyebrows tattooed in order to be more attractive to humans. And then there were a couple individuals that are considered to have genetic mutations, as they do sport armpit hair and chest hair. There's also a wide difference in the expression of these skull nodes, some being incredibly prominent, others barely noticeable, and some are shaped so much that they look like a different species. While there's also the odd fact that they come in so many colors. Their skin color and eye color have more variety than any other species in the galaxy, with each coming in just about any color you could think of, and in any combination, along with different color stripe patterns and mottling. Each of these colors was about equally expressed in the population, though there was some belief that there was a subspecies that developed into the red and blue hues. Blues were called Rudians, and were the most common, while the red were called Lethan, and were the most rare. All of this variation, from the number of Lekus, hair and color expression, head nodes, etc., left many biologists to wonder if this was solely the result of natural mutation, or the result of genetic manipulation by some advanced alien species. Perhaps evidence of the Rakata and Asha involvement, the artificially created Twi'leks mixing with the naturally evolving ones. Here I should note that some later researchers in the New Republic felt that the Yavitha species was a genetic relative to the Twi'lek, though why they thought this isn't really clear. As for their diets, they were omnivores, even having multiple stomachs in order to process just about any sort of calorie source they came across. This was likely developed out of the incredibly harsh conditions on Ryloth. Their homeworld was tidally locked, meaning it rotated with one side always facing the sun, and the other side always facing the darkness of space. So this temperature difference created intense weather conditions, in a climate that reduced their forests to a band along the equator, with some bioluminescent jungles on the dark side. Heat storms were a catastrophic seasonal issue that were faster than a Category 5 hurricane and hotter than an oven. Enormous storms that would consume the Brightlands. Throw on top of this the terrifying creatures like the Dalshem, Lilac, and Gutkur, and you can see why the earliest of Twi'leks developed by setting up in this world's deep cave systems. They came to eat small rodents and various types of mosses, which really pushed the capabilities of their stomachs. Over time, they would domesticate the Rykrit and expand their cities out of the caves, but never far from the cave openings, mostly carved into the face of cliffsides, with some smaller buildings and villages nearby. Even the capital of Lesu, although it appears to stand alone from the mainland, is likely connected to a vast series of underground caves, or at least artificial tunnels that connect to other cave systems. And for almost all of their history up to this point, they were a civilization that was supposedly relatively peaceful and modest, having close family ties and their highest technology being things like wind turbines, but nothing advanced enough to allow them to be a spacefaring race. Ryloth would be discovered by Old Republic explorers in the year 10,000 BBY, and the Twi'lek species would quickly go from a simple backwater people to one of the most recognized species in the entire galaxy. Ryloth is located in coordinates R17 in the Outer Rim, but it was along the important and lucrative Corellian trade route. The only problem was there wasn't much to trade. Nobody was interested in their wide array of artisanal molds or cuts of tough Rykrit steaks. At this point, no one had discovered any useful minerals, gases, or oils, nothing that could really fetch a credit in the galactic markets. But there was one thing that caught the eye of the alien visitors. I want you to really think about this. Imagine what it was like from the point of view of the Twi'leks. How strange, scary, and immoral this series of events would be. They went from not having any kind of spacefaring capabilities, not even reaching any of Ryloth's 5 moons, going from that to being contacted by a federation of aliens that contained not just one, but multiple strange species, all saying that there was a booming galaxy of trillions of individuals all partaking in the miracles of an interconnected galactic economy. Talk of hyperdrives to slip out of this plane of existence, psychic monk warriors that protect the government, in addition to the countless mundane everyday pleasures and goods that could be provided if the Twi'leks would simply join the galaxy at large. But again, what could they offer? These alien visitors took an instant liking to the women of your species, and quickly found out that they could interbreed with them, resulting in no harmful side effects. In fact, a pretty nice mixing of traits, just like you might expect if 2 humans bred. These aliens say that if you would sell off your women, your people could have access to this miraculous technology. Massive slaver operations were not yet seen on Ryloth. Instead, it would be the individual families that sold off their young girls to the alien visitors. While her family back home would be given a sum of credits that would get their foot in the galactic door. Some males would sell themselves off, and all of this was allowed by the Republic because they were technically indentured servants. They accepted payment for their services, and there was a fixed start date and end date, regardless of whether this wage was so low that no one could ever get out of this bondage, or if the contract range lasted the equivalent of a Twi'lek's lifespan. And so the Twi'lek leadership sacrificed their youth on the altar of high technology. And from then on out, they would be one of the most ubiquitous species in the galaxy. Next to humans, Twi'leks can be seen in more places and on more planets than any other species. All tied to the fact that so many alien species found them attractive, and that the males also sold themselves off to anyone who was buying. So everything from mines and shipyards, clubs and cantinas, to palaces and penthouses were filled with some form of Twi'lek servant. Their government on Ryloth was run by the 5 leaders of the 5 different clans that were based in the 5 largest cities on the planet. They did nothing to stop the trade, and many just reasoned it as being a necessary step in the great leap forward into the galactic economy. One of the ways this was rationalized by some of the clan leaders was that it may have been better for the children to grow up as slaves in a high-tech society than stay back on Ryloth with its gross foods, terrifying beasts, primitive medicines, and yearly fiery death hurricanes. But what was reasoned as necessary for the Twi'leks to catch up to the galaxy would become a staple of this world, and made this species one synonymous with slavery. As the trade grew, it was no longer families selling off their children, but many Twi'leks took up the new profession of slaver, launching raids on villages to collect as many people as possible, often with the assistance of high-tech alien weaponry. And then things got even worse. With the advanced medicine, communications, travel, and entertainment, came the tech that could do more detailed scans of their homeworld. It was discovered that the surface of Ryloth contained incredible quantities of a psychoactive substance, one that would come to be known as Rill spice. Various worlds like Kessel had spice, but Rill was unique to this world, and hence the name. It had a unique combination of euphoric and sedative properties that combined excellently with another type of spice known as glitter stem to produce the new drug Glitterrill, a process that involved feeding Rill to an energy spider and distilling this compound out of the spider's excrement. Users across the galaxy didn't care how it was made, they just loved the high. And almost overnight, Rill became one of the most expensive substances in the galaxy. The slaver warlords now went into the drug trade, and Ryloth was quickly becoming scarred by countless mining operations. Again, their 5-clan government did not intervene, either being impotent or outright corrupt, as there does not seem to be any recorded pushback during this time. And while many Twi'leks had hopes that they would quickly become the wealthiest people in the galaxy, the Hutts had other plans. The Hutt cartels were at the peak of their power during this time, having fleets of ships that were behind only the Republic, Sith, and Chiss, and so taking over a bunch of feuding warlords was child's play. The Hutts were already the masters of the galaxy's vice trade, having the infrastructure and connections to keep the real spice flowing to every part of the galaxy. This drug went from the Twi'lek's golden ticket to the Durasteel chains that brought them even more slavery. Over the next several millennia, the Hutts would turn Ryloth into one big slave camp and drug production site. And it should be noted that the Republic claims that the slave trade started with the Hutts, but this may just be semantics, as there were accounts of Twi'leks being sold off as entertainers long before the Hutt invasion. It's just that with the Hutts came open slave markets, with no pretense of indentured servitude, but from the point of view of the girls who danced their entire lives in cantinas, slavery was not some new Hutt invention. The Sith Empire also had no qualms with saying that their strength came from the subjugation of various slaves, but the Republic had to claim a higher ideal. And the explosion of outright slavery under the Hutts of this era is what's being used by Republic historians to act like the Hutts brought this sin to Ryloth, when in reality the Hutts only refined and expanded the practice that began that fateful day when those old Republic explorers set foot on Ryloth, and both the people of the Republic and Twi'lek families began trading people for goods and services. This Hutt cartel reign is what permanently changed the galactic census, with only 1 billion Twi'leks residing on-world, with 24% of the population being alien species. A vast majority of Twi'leks were found off-world, spread over countless planets, and over the generations many felt no connection to Ryloth. Just the generic, galactic basic-speaking monoculture that developed in massive melting pots like Coruscant. This Hutt rule would traumatize the Twi'lek consciousness, with even senators in the New Republic era circa 35 ABY, reminding the galaxy of their time under the fat green thumb of the Hutt overlords.
The history of my planet and my people is well known. For centuries, we suffered under the oppression of the Hutts and their criminal enterprises.
This terrible fate was somewhat assisted by a cultural mindset that was instilled by the weather of Ryloth. With things like those massive heat storms, there was a popular proverb that said, "You can't defeat a storm, you must ride the storm." The Twi'leks that sold their own people during these ancient times, and even the later Bib Fortuna, used proverbs like this to explain their behavior, thinking this slave economy was an enormous storm produced by the conditions of their place in the galactic economy. Just as Ryloth suffered from its place in rotation, the Twi'lek could not defeat the slave trade, better to find their place in it. But I need to point out that obviously this was not accepted by all Twi'leki. There were many Twi'leks that possessed incredible connections to the Force and were picked up by Jedi or Sith, and others were able to work their way out of indentured servitude and establish legitimate businesses across the galaxy. Not every family sold off people to the aliens, and many were able to find lives that were full of a sense of righteous honor. Several would join the Mandalorians, a people that may have seemed like war-loving monsters, but from the Twi'lek point of view, they just saw a people that ran their society in a pure meritocracy. If you could earn your respect, you got it. Mandalorians did start off as the name of a species, but very early on in their history they started to include any species that would vow to live in accordance with the Mandalorian codes of honor, a reaction to a time when the Mandalorians lost their homeworld, something many Twi'leks felt a connection to, as many felt that Ryloth was lost to the Hutts. The Twi'leks were one of the most abundant non-human Mandalorians, rising to high positions in many clans, and even inventing things like the Cherokee starfighter. In the year 3643 BBY, a slave revolt aided by off-world forces was able to drive the slugs back onto their ships and off of this planet. But things really didn't get a whole lot better. The clan leadership did not figure out ways to develop any new industry, just continue the lucrative spice operations. Essentially, they became the new warlords, and the Hutts simply used their control of the black markets to dictate the prices of Rill. To the point that the Hutts may have actually been making even more profit by just letting the tailheads deal with managing the mines. And then you might think that they might start to turn away from slavery, but their leaders actually felt that if they cut off the supply of slaves, some other powerful off-world force may come and take them over. So the spice and slaves flowed for the next couple thousand years, all under Twi'lek leadership and with no meaningful intervention by the Republic. Just occasional lip service by senators seeking votes, but at the end of the day it was just some Outer Rim problem. The Republic let countless wounds like this fester for thousands of years, eventually leading to the push to secede, a movement that came to a head in the Clone Wars with the rise of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Senator Orn Free Taa would keep Ryloth in the Republic, but the population was torn about 50-50 on who to support. There were good arguments for both, as the Republic had undeniably let them suffer by not intervening for what was now 10,000 years, but some of the companies and member worlds within the CIS were the ones currently profiting off of their slave labor. And although you might think that the Republic aligning with the Hutts, the hated once overlords of the Twi'leks, would make it so they could never align with the Republic, it seems like the clan leadership and senators actually liked the fact that the Hutts were official allies. Ryloth's whole economy still revolved around serving the Hutts, so really their choice was decided for them when Jabba pledged his cartel to the Republic. In an attempt to strike a monetary blow to the Republic's powerful Hutt allies, Dooku launched an all-out planetary invasion of Ryloth early on in the war, showing that the clan leadership was correct in identifying that they would never be allowed to work with the Hutts and be a part of the CIS. If Dooku could hold Ryloth, perhaps he could get Jabba to go back on his word and at least be neutral during this conflict, allowing neither the CIS or Republic to travel through Hutt space or use it as a staging area. Something that would hurt the Republic a lot more, as most of the Outer Rim was under the control of the CIS. Though about half of the Rylothans welcomed the CIS as liberators, the Twi'lek resistance movement rose up to face the droid army. Cham Syndulla would work with the Jedi and Republic forces to eventually capture Wat Tambor. The success of Syndulla's forces led to a new populist movement that opposed their clan leaders and senators. All these past years of talk had been framed as pro-CIS or pro-Republic. The majority of Twi'leki were now calling for an independent Ryloth. And at the end of the Clone Wars, the Empire actually granted this wish. Ryloth was finally a free world. And if this seemed too good to be true, that's because, of course it was. This is Ryloth. The sleazy Senator Orn Free Taa convinced his people to allow him to stay on as senator, but promised this was only a name, a formality in this tumultuous transition to Empire, but that officially they would be free. Emperor Palpatine was fine with taking away whatever powers from the senator that the tailheads asked for, because they were too slow to pick up on the new position of Imperial Moff. This was where all the power was in the time of the Empire, and Moff Delian Mors was the effective ruler of Ryloth. Let the Twi'leks form whatever on-world government they wished, it all had to pass through the Moff. After 5 years of this, Cham Syndulla reformed his fighters to what he would now call the Free Ryloth movement. This was a network of hundreds of spies and soldiers, and not just from the Twi'lek species, that would raid dozens of Imperial sites ranging from outposts to Imperial Star Destroyers. Cham decided that the full force of his movement would be used to take out Palpatine and Vader all in one attack when he learned that they were visiting Ryloth via the ISD Perilous. Space mines, repurposed vulture droids, and even rebels posing as a rescue crew still could not bring about the deaths of their targets. His daughter Hera Syndulla would see that this empire was too skilled, too large, and too powerful to be taken out by just Rylothans. She felt this newly forming rebel alliance was their answer, while her father felt that she would just be replacing one master for another. But after a decade, she would be able to get her father to see that the Free Ryloth movement and Rebel Alliance could and needed to be allies.
During the Clone War, you didn't just fight for a village. You rallied everyone to liberate the entire planet. You inspired me. The rebellion is no different.
After Grand Admiral Thrawn brought the full might of his empire to bombard Ryloth into submission, hoping to force them into giving up the dissidents amongst their population. During Thrawn's campaign, we see how much he studied the Twi'lek culture.
It's a Kalikori, a revered Twi'lek heirloom passed from parent to child through generations.
Now think about just how large the Syndulla compound is, how she still has this connection to her ancient family ties, and how that old proverb about riding out the storm may have applied to her ancestors. I don't want to say that any successful family on Ryloth has to be tied to spice and slavery, but if the Syndullas were, it does put Hera and Cham's movement in greater context. Not just rebelling against the corruption of the Republic and then Empire, but standing up against thousands of years of Twi'leks accepting and becoming complicit in this corruption. They would continue this fight for the next several years, battles which prove that betting on the Rebel Alliance was the right move, and these new allies would actually help them continue the fight on Ryloth, eventually completely freeing the world from any foreign influence in the year 5 ABY. And for once, they actually stayed free. They elected a former Twi'lek rebel soldier named Yendor to be their representative in the Senate, but just as an emissary, providing the Senate updates on the Twi'lek's wishes and their opinions on galactic policies, but not being bound to the decisions of the Senate. And then he would provide updates on galactic affairs to the more democratically elected government on world. The only threat to their peace came around 30 years later. After the abrupt death of Jabba the Hutt, there had been a power vacuum that attracted thugs from every parsec, all wanting to be the next big infamous mob boss. A Nikto by the name of Rin Riven Dai was quickly earning this reputation in the underworld, and his organization relied on the font of real spice. Emissary Yendor would travel to Hosnian Prime to make a plea to the New Republic, pointing out that this was not just a Ryloth problem.
Rin Riven's cartel presents a danger to Ryloth's future. Tomorrow, however, it could threaten the rule of law in the New Republic itself, as the Hutts did in both the Old Republic and the Empire.
Leia would personally investigate and discover that this crime empire was being sponsored by some mysterious military organization in the unknown regions. The First Order was using Ryloth as a way to poison the galaxy at large, investing enormous amounts of credits into the spice trade, reaping incredible returns on this investment that fueled their war machine, while also weakening the citizenry of their soon-to-be enemy. And in this time, the ethic of fierce independence instilled by Cham worked to nearly get the Resistance killed. After Leia reached out to contacts on Ryloth to provide her ragged fleet a place to hide after their devastating loss on Crate, they found a great hiding spot in one of the thousands of cave systems of Ryloth. But the FO received a tip that they were harboring Resistance fighters. They set up capital ships in atmosphere, threatening a full planetary bombardment and blockade if they were not given the location of the Resistance members. Leia's forces tried to scramble, but they were betrayed, and the FO swarmed the cave system and compounded the losses from Crate. Poe Dameron was more morally defeated by this, saying the Twi'lek's betrayal made him lose hope that they would be taken in by anyone. But this was just the result of his ignorance of Ryloth history. We have to see why the Rylothans would be afraid to be dragged into another war with galactic superpowers. The Resistance endangered them by hiding out on Ryloth. And while it's true that the FO would have almost certainly returned them to slavery, this reaction was understandable with the Star Destroyers in orbit. But after the destruction of the First Order, Ryloth would see the longest stretch of peace in 10,000 years. No longer a world that was only exporting spice and slaves. They worked to rebuild and unify the Twi'leks that had been spread throughout the stars. So that's it for the complete breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. I'll get into more detail on this in Bib Fortuna's complete life video, but after laying out all of the slave history, I thought I should mention how Bib was an evil genius. He says that he wanted to uplift his people out of slavery and spice, and hoped to take over the Hutt cartels from within, eventually developing the Twi'leks into spy masters and assassins, using the fact that the galaxy just took for granted that a Twi'lek must be a lowly servant, and turning that into their advantage. Nobody would suspect them, and they were ubiquitous. Not really out of place anywhere, from a Coruscant penthouse to a Tatooine cantina. His plan was never realized, but Hera would help to change the perception by becoming one of the most beloved veterans of the Galactic Civil War, after she achieved the rank of general. Toward the end of the Civil War and into the New Republic era, Wedge Antilles was working alongside Twi'leks, and they explained that his name, if read in the normal way, actually translated to one so foul he could induce vomiting in a rancor. But just by dropping a letter and using their comma name breakup convention, they referred to him as Wedge Antilles, which was much better and meant Slayer of Stars. The first appearance of a Twi'lek was Bib in Return of the Jedi, but the name Twi'lek was not mentioned until 1987 in the RPG guide The Star Wars Sourcebook. One of the Clone Wars writers, Henry Gilroy, said that he and Dave Filoni created the Liberation of Ryloth arc to help show a different side of the Twi'leks other than the sexualized depictions of Aayla Secura, Darth Talon, and Ula, but also that choosing the Twi'lek was great for that first season because it was easier to work off of the human templates. The French accent that the Twi'leks used was something that was specifically chosen by George Lucas. There's no official explanation as to why, but many fans think that it's a reference to the French resistance fighters during World War II. Originally, the Twi'lek species could not interbreed with humans, explicitly stated in Order 66, a Republic Commando novel, and Imperial Commando 501st. They state that if you were to transfer something to the womb, it required extensive genetic engineering. And related to this subject, have some fun with, or be horrified by what you can find when Googling Twi'lek on Google. There are so many people asking weird questions that when you type in something like Twi'lek Sith, so many people have also searched why are Twi'lek so attractive that Google has the snippet already queued up for you, with a hilariously circular answer. The X-Wing video game called their homeworld Twi'lek, and over the years they've been seen in almost every Star Wars game created. And as for some lore resources, canon stuff comes from the books Star Wars Absolutely Everything You Need to Know, Complete Visual Dictionary, A New Dawn, Galactic Atlas, and the Star Wars Sourcebook. While in Legends there's the Essential Guide to Alien Species, Guide to Characters, Ultimate Alien Anthology, and the Force and Destiny Core Rulebook. So that's it for the complete breakdown of the Twi'lek species. The question to you guys is, how do you think the Twi'lek people should have responded to the alien visitors? We see tons of species that stay with the culture and tech they had pre-first contact. They didn't sacrifice their people to get all kinds of new stuff. But then again, the entire galaxy wasn't after Tusken or Wookiee women. So what do you think they should have done? But most important of all, remember, if you're going to sell your people off to join the high-tech galactic economy, use your slave and spice profits to actually develop some high-tech industries. And the Force will be with you, always.
The Twi'lek people welcome us to Ryloth, where the planet's rotation has created two vastly different regions, one of perpetual light and one of perpetual darkness.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will be the complete history of Ryloth, using everything from both legends and canon to provide as much information as possible on the homeworld of the Twi'lek people. We'll cover everything from its location in the galaxy, flora, fauna, economy, government, and the major historical events that all played out on Ryloth. A world that was always being dragged into the conflicts of the major powers of the galaxy, most notably the Jedi-backed Republic and Sith-run empires. But also the cartels. Be it for slavery or spice, Ryloth was one of the most raided planets in galactic history. But let's head to grid coordinates R17 of the galactic map. In the Outer Rim territories, right on the major Corellian-run trade route, with notable neighbors like Geonosis, Tatooine, and Naboo. The Ryloth star system contained a single sun, and was in the second orbital position between planets Mon Bala and Ortuma. A Goldilocks zone to the extreme, as Mon Bala was molten rock, and Ortuma was just covered in miles of ice. Ryloth's terrain was as varied as Earth's, with areas of forests, plains, ice caps, deserts, and mountains. And the atmosphere was relatively thin, but still plenty of breathable air to get it classified as Type 1, just like most of the major planets in the galaxy. But the weather was apocalyptic. This was the result of a complicated interaction between the powerful sunlight, the 5 moons that orbited Ryloth, its liquid water core, and the fact that the planet was tidally locked, meaning that one side of Ryloth always faced the sun, while the other side always faced away, a dark side just like our moon. This made it so the Terminator line, the place where those two sides meet, being the prime real estate on Ryloth, with the most temperate conditions being either too hot or too cold. But as it made its 305 standard day journey around the sun, it would get closer or farther away from this star, making for incredible weather events during these seasons. The most frightening were called heat storms, which brought temperatures of 300 degrees Celsius or 572 degrees Fahrenheit, with this day-night differential causing incredible winds that were recorded as high as 500 kilometers per hour or 310 miles per hour, which is more than 4 times the hottest places on Earth, and about twice the wind speed of a Category 5 hurricane. Because of this, the early Twi'leks grew their civilizations underground, and the immense networks of caves that connected the entire planet. A perfect place to call home, as those caves also contained well springs that were fed by that liquid water core. Plant life consisted of various green trees and bushes, with stunning bioluminescent varieties on the night side, which would glow in these bright whites and purples. There was abundant wildlife here as well, with the blurg becoming a trusty mount, and the Gutkur being fierce predators. The 3-meter-long cancels would act as a flying mount, the Rykrit, which was a sort of mix of a boar and a cow, and 2 of the most nightmare-inducing creatures to be found on any world, the Dalsham and Lilac. Most of the animals would primarily live on the dark side of Ryloth, but the Lilacs roamed the arid sections of the Brightlands, in places like the Crater Sea, which would also become the home to a major pod race course.
Now, judging by the blinding sun overhead, I'd have to say we're in the Brightlands. And it's hot out here, folks. Worse than Tatooine. Luckily, we're in the coolest region of the Brightlands, so hopefully our racers won't overheat too quickly. Be sure to watch for the great tusks, one of this area's most well-known features. And then it's out to the Crater Sea, where we're sure to see some great combat action.
There were some other notable locations, like a secret bounty hunting guild fortress established in a series of mountains dubbed the Lonely Five. And a 2-day walk into the Brightlands from the village of Bashka would have you arriving at a Jedi-established enclave for liberated slaves. And there was even a Sith Academy set up on world to train spies and assassins for Lord Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness, likely set up somewhere on the dark side of the planet. On a side note, if you watched our Bib Fortuna video, you'll remember that his ultimate goal was to take power of the Hutt Empire so that he could conquer Ryloth and help establish academies to develop his people into spies and mercenaries that would be useful to the Empire. And then there was Ryloth's biggest tourist spot, the Floating Rock Gardens. Those insane winds and series of caves created a once-in-a-galaxy phenomena, where enormous boulders would float on the strong currents like stone clouds. Eventually, stones of all sorts were caught in the currents, and people often added new ones, creating for a beautiful assortment that made this phenomena seem even more magical. For just a small fee, tourists would come from all over to witness the spectacle, and many would add their own small stones into the streams of wind shooting out of various caves. Though this was allowed, the local Twi'lek guides would teach the visitors that there is much to be gained in quietly contemplating the natural movements of these stones. How we are all like these stones, things caught in a current too complex to understand, and without which we would come crashing down in an instant, smashing to pieces if this invisible force failed to keep us afloat. A meditation that was meaningful to ancient Rylothans, but was lost on most Coruscanti visitors. But of course, floating, metaphysically significant rocks were not what most people thought of when picturing Ryloth. More like spice rocks, the mind-altering drug that could be processed by the substance Rill that was only found on Ryloth. But that was only after their first contact with alien species. When the planet was discovered by the Old Republic's explorers 10,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Twi'leks they discovered were not a spacefaring race. They used windmills to turn their most hostile climate feature into a way to power their homes which were carved into the sides of mountains as they increasingly found ways to move out from their deep cave systems. Their main sources of food were a cultivated mold, as well as domesticated rykrits for meat. The most populous race in the Republic was humans, and they immediately took an interest in the females of this twin-headed species. And it wasn't long before they realized that they could interbreed with these generally lean, athletic, and multicolored people. This ability of a human to mate with a Twi'lek, and other species like the Zabrak, is due to the fact that they were created by the ancient Rakata mother machine known as a Shah.
I am a Shah, the mother machine. My children are as numerous as the Rakata once were. I called them Twi'lek, Sabrak, Eshka.
Now the Twi'lek government was in the form of the Clan Council, located in the capital city of Lesu. Their council consisted of the 5 males that represented the heads of the 5 clans spread over Ryloth. This government would stay intact for thousands of years, even with its peculiar practice that when one council member died, all of the others would walk into the Brightlands until they eventually died of exposure or by being ripped apart by beasts. But one decision that the council either encouraged or failed to ban was the practice of families selling off their women to these new alien visitors. Remember, Ryloth is on one of the most lucrative trade routes in the galaxy. Now with Republic technology, this Outer Rim world was connected to the deep core, and could partake in the galactic economy. These aliens had no interest in their mediocre meats and farmed algae, but the female Twi'lek figure caught the eye of nearly all other alien species. From humans to Hutts, Weequay to Chiss, everyone seemed to be attracted to them. So the Twi'lek families sacrificed their women on the altar of high technology. Parents sending their daughters off never to be seen again, pleasing their buyers with exotic dances, or often much worse, while the rest of the Twi'leks were able to get their foot in the galactic door. It should be noted that merchants found ways around the Republic's anti-slavery laws by simply having these girls sign that they were not being forced into service, and that they were only selling those services on a contract with a start date and stop date, being paid with an outlined amount of credits. This didn't take into account the social pressure that all but forced them to become slaves, or rather I should put it so we don't get sued by the Hutt cartel lobby, forced them to become indentured servants. Many of these families would use these ill-earned credits to travel the galaxy and set up respectable businesses, creating a whole new life on places as diverse as Coruscant and Tatooine, growing their own families for many generations, and feeling no cultural ties to Ryloth anymore, or any sense of connection to this original sin of their species. And to be fair, we must imagine that there were still countless Twi'leks that either found employment with the alien visitors, or males that also sold themselves into indentured servitude, making it so they were barely above slavery in that first generation, but over time could partake in the galactic dream. But as this business model grew, Twi'lek started to enslave each other. No longer families setting up the contracts, but Twi'lek warlords would organize to attack villages and round up women for the off-world markets. And they would either kill the men or keep them to be worked to death as slaves, mining the latest vice to be discovered on Ryloth. With the Republic's advanced civilization came the technology that could detect the medicinal properties of a substance in the ground that would come to be known as Rill, named after Ryloth. This was a gold rush for drugs, as there were several forms of drugs classified as spice that could be developed into a wide array of helpful, therapeutic medicines, or into any manner of stimulant, depressant, or hallucinogen for recreational use. And there was the fact that just like with the contracted workers loophole, the fact that this could be legally mined and sold if intended for medicinal use meant that you could legally open up a spice mine on Ryloth. This is what finally drew in the big players, as the small-time Twi'lek slavers were conquered and either destroyed or hired out to manage the operations of galaxy-spanning cartels, like those of the Hutts, Pikes, and Pheylines of Black Sun. This explosion of criminal elements would remain a permanent feature of Ryloth from the year 4800 BBY on, resulting in 24% of the population being off-worlders, and their global population being only 1.5 billion, with the vast majority of Twi'leks leaving their homeworld, abandoning it to the rule of crime. It is true that ostensibly their council still ruled, but we must assume that with the amounts of underworld credits flowing into Ryloth, and the fact that it would remain this way for thousands of years, the majority of the actual decision makers must have been in some way corrupted by these alien crime lords. And then what grew out of this that made it even worse is that because it was now a powerful economic world, specifically within criminal elements, it was always attracting Jedi and Sith. The Jedi continuously chasing down some dangerous new spice shipment, high-level thug, or assassin that was somehow linked back to Ryloth. And then on the other end, there were Sith that were often working alongside these criminals, which meant that during the several wars between the Old Republic and Sith Empire, not to mention the civil wars amongst the Jedi and Sith themselves, Ryloth was often dragged into military-scale warfare in addition to the endless cartel wars. This was just another reason for the Twi'leks to feel even less of an attachment to their homeworld or have any desire to return. But it should be noted that the most famous of their species were all born here, even though only a small percentage of Twi'leks ever saw Ryloth. Anun Bandara was the Jedi Watchman for the Ryloth system, and he would detect the presence of a young Aayla Secura, while Beezer and Bib Fortuna, Cham and Hera Syndulla were all born on-world, as were Senators Conestrel, Cham Frey Ka, and Orn Free Taa. During the Clone Wars that would break out in 22 BBY, Ryloth's location in the Outer Rim meant that it was one of the first to fall to the CIS, where it was secured with a massive blockade and heavy troop presence on-world. Senator Orn Free Taa wanted to keep the planet loyal to the Republic, but his people were pretty evenly split. Though some must have heard the reports of natives being used as living shields, you could understand why these people felt abandoned by the Republic. Still in the middle of a war between two superpowers, now 10,000 years after Ryloth was discovered. And that war would ravage nearly every city, and then their social structure was degraded even further. When the Empire took control, they did rein in some of the crime. Palpatine could not permit lawlessness, but he would leave some cartels in power to manipulate his people, though not letting them control an entire world or monopolize the spice Rill. And while that might have seemed nice at first, the human high culture policy would push down all Twi'leks to the role of second-class citizens. Even the top members of the 5 ruling clan families could find themselves enslaved, hauled off to work some Imperial site. It did motivate many of them to secretly support the Rebel Alliance, and Ryloth would become a frequent pickup point for materials and intel. By the year 14 BBY, Ryloth was ruled by Moff Delian Moors, who chose to reside on one of their moons instead of being surrounded by the head-tails on-world. Over the years, there would be the loss of at least one Imperial-class Star Destroyer in Cham Syndulla's attempt to eliminate Vader and Palpatine in one devastating blow. And Hera and the Spectres were able to take out an Arquitens-class command cruiser and steal a Quasar Fire-class carrier, shenanigans that eventually brought Grand Admiral Thrawn to Ryloth to lock it down. Imperial garrisons would remain here for an entire year after the Battle of Endor, finally fleeing in the year 5 ABY, upon which an ex-rebel fighter would represent Ryloth to the New Republic Senate. Notice I say to, but not in the NR, as finally this world would try to remain neutral. being allies to the New Republic, but not in their senate or under their authority. And this did secure peace for an entire generation, but the old specter of crime lords was still haunting this world. With Jabba's death, there were countless small-scale thugs trying to be the next big mob boss. And on Ryloth, it would be the Nikto crime lord Rinrin Vindai that was growing a cartel that would rival the Great Jabbas. Eventually, this cartel was so powerful that the Twi'lek emissary traveled to Hosnian Prime to make a plea to the Senate, saying this problem on Ryloth would grow to infect the entire galaxy.
Today, Rin Riven's cartel presents a danger to Ryloth's future, and to free trade in our part of the galaxy. Tomorrow, however, it could threaten the rule of law in the New Republic itself, as the Hutts did in both the Old Republic and the Empire.
Leia Organa would personally investigate the rapid rise of Rinrin Vindai's cartel, finding the first signs of the First Order, as funding to these criminals was coming from some military organization in the unknown regions. The FO using the spice trade to make incredible returns on their investments, while simultaneously corrupting the population of their future enemy in the New Republic. Once this war came to a head and the Resistance was nearly destroyed on Crate, General Organa would reach out to her contacts on Ryloth, who allowed the Resistance to set up a secret base in one of the planet's cave systems. Some Twi'leks thought this was going to get them dragged into another galactic-scale war, and the Resistance was betrayed to the FO after they made it known that they had 5 days to give up the Resistance before they would put their fleets in orbit for a full blockade. The FO launched a raid on the Resistance location, compounding the devastating loss on Crate, and even less of them limped off this time. In a way, this betrayal on Ryloth was the lowest point of the Resistance, convincing individuals like Poe Dameron that no place in the galaxy would welcome them. But knowing the history of this planet, it is no shock that the Twi'leks were afraid of Ryloth being involved in another war, being the enemies of a superpower that had taken out an entire system, just the latest of wars in the 10,000 plus year history of this world, in which Ryloth could hardly be said to have benefited. So that's it for the complete history of Ryloth, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. There are some discrepancies in the lore, like it's said to have a night side, that Twi'leks can only live along that thin slice right up against the Terminator, but then it also says that it has a 30 standard hour day rotation. That was added because of its appearance in the Clone Wars show, and was later confirmed in the Essential Atlas. But the harsh weather conditions remained confirmed in the lore, while they were also supposedly caused by the planet being tidally locked. And then we have the fact that the Twi'leks were brought by the Tho-Yor to Tython in 36,000 BBY, but Asha, the Mother Machine, claims to have made them around 10,000 BBY. Grand Moff Tarkin had a Twi'lek administrator at the secret outpost of the Maw installation, where they would oversee hundreds if not thousands of Twi'lek slave laborers. And the way Twi'leks carved their homes out of the cliff walls and caves was based on the Anasazi people, specifically the ruins that are found in the Mesa Verde National Park. Now a lot of this info in canon comes from Ultimate Star Wars and the Galactic Atlas, as well as the novels Tarkin and Bloodline. And in Legends, it was the Essential Atlas, Clone Wars Campaign Guide, and the New Essential Chronology. But most important of all, remember, when the aliens arrive, don't give up your women for their high tech, and definitely don't let them scan your soil for addictive drugs. And the Force will be with you, always.
Kessel. It's a mining colony, but the Imperials often keep political prisoners here too.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to be all about the Legends history and breakdown of Kessel. If you saw the canon version, I mentioned how this is one of the most changed with planets in all of Star Wars. I mean, just look at it. The Legends version wouldn't even be called a planet by NASA standards, not having a spherical shape, so it's more of a planetoid or an asteroid. And the history is completely different as well. I'd say it's a lot more crazy and interconnected to the other lore, so let's just jump right into it. Kessel is located at grid coordinates T10, in the Outer Rim territories. It rotates around one sun, named Kessa, and has one moon, which was called the Garrison Moon. A day is 26 hours long and a year is 322 days. And here you can see how that differs from the canon Kessel and other important worlds. Because of this bean shape, there are a couple different numbers for the diameter, being 6,632 kilometers at the narrowest point, and 7,980 kilometers at the widest, which would make it a little more than half the size of Earth, and about 60 times the Death Star 1. Now there was no atmosphere at first, but as factories popped up, the emissions eventually built up a very thin atmosphere that got it a Type 3 ranking, meaning it was still too thin to breathe for most organics. It was also described as being very cold, and as you might expect, the terrain was all just flats, craters, tunnels all throughout the world, and countless rocky mountains. But interestingly, there are some native species: the energy spider, Taras Chai, and bogey. The simplest were those bogies, being about 5 centimeters or about 2 inches, and completely composed of just energy, having no mass and can pass through anything, but drain the power of many electronics. The Celestials, those beings that shaped the galaxy eons before even the most ancient of empires, created an absurdly complex machine under the surface of Kessel, a machine that was sort of an astrological clock, with these bogies somehow being able to collect data from other beings and tech that later arrived on Kessel. Somehow they transmitted that to the Celestials on another plane of existence. So the bogies are like a bridge between realms, but could still be interacted with from beings from our plane, namely the energy spiders. Also known as spice spiders, the glitter stem in their webs would trap the bogies, an interaction that released light and attracted the spiders, who would then consume them as their main food source. There was also the Taras Chai, the small 3-centimeter insects that would often be eaten by the slaves that were forced to work the many spice mines. But this glitter stem material in the spiders' webs was one of the most sought-after drugs in the galaxy. And millennia of these webs being spun in the tunnels on Kessel led to the glitter stem seeping into the dust and rock that comprised this world. And it was the only source of glitter stem in the entire galaxy. But something that's often overlooked is that in Legends, one of the effects of glitter stem is that it gave you telepathic abilities. They only last a short time as the drug quickly wears off. But you really gotta keep in mind what it is that you are consuming. The interdimensional godlike Celestials used the bogies as a sort of light code, downloading information from the species and tech they came across, and somehow passing that information over to Celestials on a different plane. Those bogies are then trapped in the glitter stem, the only material that seems to stop them, and then they're eaten by these spiders that produce even more glitter stem. This drug, or spice, interacts with every sentient species in the galaxy, and then gives them the ability to communicate outside of the normal limits of the closed physical universe. A hallucinogen that was placed here by the gods and that connects you to this separate realm. I think it's safe to say that these Legends lore writers were reading a lot of McKenna or Graham Hancock. Things like psychedelic mushrooms that are literally called the flesh of the gods in certain cultures. So although in canon spice is almost exclusively a negative thing, at least in Legends this glitter stem seems to be a lot like hallucinogens here on Earth. And that similar complexity of being stigmatized and worshipped by certain people seems to have existed in the galaxy far, far away. But in both Legends and canon, the problem is that crime syndicates are able to refine it to be incredibly dangerous and addictive. And there were enormous profits in this, dating back to at least 25,000 BBY, with Zim the Despot taking over Kessel and locking down the spice market. But of course it would be targeted by every crime lord over the millennia. Even the ancient Sith had tombs and ruins here, though the exact reason and purpose for them being on this planetoid is still unknown. The Hutts and Pikes would have the biggest influence in the modern era, setting up many factories and bringing in thousands of slaves. But the Empire eventually locked the planet down for themselves. Early into their rule, they set up at least 3 detention centers, and now any Imperial dissidents could find themselves being worked to death mining the spice, which they would have claimed could have been used for legitimate medicines, but it was rumored to have been used to prop up whatever crime boss the Empire was using at that time. He who controlled the spice controlled the galaxy, in the sense that every criminal warlord was now made or broken by the Emperor. Where crime could flourish and which lords would rule the underworld were in complete control of the Empire, at least in theory, as it was an evil symbiotic relationship which allowed the Empire to justify their infringement on civil liberties. Just as Palpatine controlled both sides of the Clone Wars, the Emperor's war on crime was manipulated similarly, with the ability to make or break criminal empires with the flow of spice. And so Kessel had to be highly regulated, with 700 personnel overseeing 10,400 prisoners, but with the prisoners being ranked and pitted against each other as well. An interesting psychological trick to make ambitious and skilled prisoners feel as if they were in control of something, even with a life sentence on the most infamous rock in the galaxy. Also, that 700 personnel was just the Imperial humans, but a lot of the running of the station was via the Colicoids, a creepy insect species that built a lot of the CIS ships, vehicles, and droids. This was the same species who had cathedral-like shipyards, and thought that design itself was something holy. So I wonder if they felt any reverence in managing an operation that mined the substance that connected the psychic and physical planes, as this Imperial Colicoid alliance is extremely odd. Even before the Battle of Yavin, the Rebel Alliance had launched some daring raids on Kessel to rescue some POWs. And in a separate incident, the notorious Tiber Zahn staged a prisoner revolt and escaped with one of his allies. To tighten this up, the Imps put several enormous satellites in orbit to better connect the individual camps to the protecting fleets, which included at least one Victory class, 2 acclimators, and 2 Tartan-class patrol cruisers, along with dozens each of TIE fighters, interceptors, and bombers, and even a squad of TIE defenders. Zahn was actually crazy enough to come back with some of his consortium and take these forces on, with some accounts saying that he defeated all of the Imperial forces. When Admiral Akbar was captured by Boba Fett, he was on his way to what was likely a death sentence working the mines of Kessel. But luckily, the Star Destroyer that was transporting him was raided by Renegade Squadron, though Wedge Antilles was actually imprisoned on Kessel, and was even scheduled for execution, getting as close as being packed onto the train that was taking him to the death camp, when Luke and Rogue Squadron were able to show up and save the day, freeing Antilles and rolling this victory into freeing the majority of the prisoners on Kessel. At this point in its history, the Imps had installed several atmosphere generators, but when word of the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Endor, the commanders decided to shut these systems off, and simply work the prisoners remaining to death in this thinning atmosphere. But after liberating Kashyyyk, Solo, Lando, and Chewie, along with a contingent of Wookiee soldiers, all headed to the rescue. They were able to get the atmosphere back pumping, and eventually saved all of the prisoners. A civil war would break out amongst the Imperials, involving Hissa, Trioculus, and Morith Dul. They all ended up torturing and betraying each other trying to hold on to power, and they would keep it out of New Republic hands up until 13 ABY. Here, Nin Nub would be put in charge of the spice capital of the galaxy. He was put in place by Lando Calrissian, who, with the Imperials taken care of and the New Republic unsure what to do with it, the lifetime hustler was able to legally purchase these mines. And this is the point you can start making your conspiracy videos on how Han and Lando teamed up to finesse all of the crime bosses and even the Emperor out of the sole spice-producing planet in the galaxy, leading a whole rebellion just to become legal, monopolistic spice lords. Luke's wife, Mara Jade, helped with the general operation of Calrissian's various business ventures, but it was Nien Nunb who came up with the idea of using blind, sentient species like the craniopods to work the mines. No longer slaves, they were paid a good wage, as the medicinal and safe recreational use of spice was such a profitable business that Lando and Nub were swimming in credits, turning what was once a place synonymous with hell, where slaves were worked to death, into a career that a lot of people actually sought out, with greatly increased quality of living on site, and even the craniopods setting up thriving communities. But to bring this story full circle, when Leia and Han were helping to map out some of the uncharted tunnels, they discovered a fissure in the rock caused by a quake. This new opening led to a city-sized area, containing new life forms like fungi, centipedes, and different forms of spiders, along with a sort of miniature hawk bat. Much more biodiversity than you see elsewhere on Kessel, like some sort of hollow Kessel Earth. There was a whole world under the surface. This is when Leia was able to sense that those bogies flying about were actually transferring information into a different realm. And she was the one that connected the dots on the ancient machinery, seeing that it must all somehow have been crafted by and serving some purpose to the Celestials. After this, we don't hear a lot from Kessel, except for when the Yuuzhan Vong invaded. It was one of the many places that they captured. That's it for its history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. Order 66 survivors hid out there in one of the abandoned mines, and tried to lure Darth Vader into a trap. It didn't work. No Jedi escaped. And there's a detail that's kind of confusing, but there was a Republic-run prison/mining operation on Kessel before the Empire. Cassar Forge was a teacher in this program and helped convicts to learn how to re-enter society upon release. He would also end up being the father of 2 Rogue Squadron pilots, Blue Jane and Inriri. Its moon, named Garrison Moon, was destroyed by a prototype Death Star laser, which was concealed in the maw which enveloped Kessel. This moon is also known as the Sky Bogey by miners, a sort of larger version of the small bogies that floated around Kessel. In the original script, the word was written as Kissel, Kissel, and in the work The Second Kessel Run, Kessel was depicted as being a lush, giant, fungy forest planet. But when making the Essential Atlas, this was retconned into being Little Kessel, a world near the Kessel Run. But the new Essential chronology still had Kessel looking like a greenish-blue spherical world, and that's how it's shown in Star Wars Galaxy Jump to Lightspeed and Battlefront Renegade Squadron. And so that's probably why it looks different in canon. A lot of additional information comes from these sources. If you want to pick them up, or the real-world books that lay out some of the theories on hallucinogen connections to different realms, the stuff that seems to have inspired the Star Wars lore on this, all that's linked down below. But most important of all, remember, the Emperor was kind of a failure. The real masterminds were Lando and Nien Nunb, and the Force will be with you, always.
What are we going to do? We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel or smashed into who knows what.
What's up, meta nerds? This video is going to be a complete breakdown of the spice capital of the galaxy, Kessel. This will be everything in canon, and I'll get a separate Legends version up soon, because Kessel is actually one of the most changed planets in the lore, even being changed up a bunch in just Legends. So to make it all coherent, let's get into the canon version of this infamous and crucial world. Starting with its location, you can find it at grid coordinates T10, in the Outer Rim territories within the eponymous Kessel system, just outside of Hutt space. The planet has at least one moon, and a diameter of 7,200 kilometers, or 4,474 miles, making it more than half the size of Earth and Coruscant. The orbital period, or its year length, is 322 days, while the rotational period, or day, is 12 hours. And here are those respective stats for Coruscant and Tatooine. Its atmosphere ranged from mild tropical to being extremely hot, so much so that it was dangerous to a lot of the slave populations.
Slaves sent there last a few months, maybe a year.
And for Wookiees born in the forest, it's a death sentence.
And speaking of slave labor, it gets us into the first of many dark aspects of this world. The official report from the Coruscant census has Kessel's population at 10,000. Relatively low, it may only represent that royal city and some of the mining operators, as it appears like hundreds if not thousands of slaves work in just a single mine. So it is likely that something as mundane as a census report reveals some of what Ahsoka was talking about. Now the Republic should get involved, but layers of corruption keep this planet free from judicial intervention.
It's legendary. Yeah, it's legendary for its corruption.
Of course, it was the endless flow of credits from this planet that kept officials looking the other way, as even the naive Trace grew up hearing stories about how criminals, pirates, and smugglers achieved great riches from this mysterious world of Kessel. So everyone knew what was going on here, from the Jedi in their temple to the mechanic down in 1313. But the official fallback excuse was that the spice mined here was for medicinal purposes.
In this time of war, our spice is refined into a medicine that saves people across the galaxy.
And this was technically true. If refined in the right way, it could act as a stimulant keeping people alive, or as a sedative to reduce pain. But that's also true for most illicit drugs. And of course, Bacta was by far the primary source of medical treatment in the galaxy, being the go-to everywhere from the battlefront to medical space stations. So everyone knew the truth that it was the dangerous drugs that were brokered through the Yoruba family to the Pike Syndicate. The Pikes were one of the most powerful crime syndicates out there, but their advantage was that their homeworld and base of operations, Obadiah, was located in the same Kessel sector. This world was known to have endless shipments of spice and credits coming and going, and so was a constant site of brazen pirate attacks. But at least this relative proximity made it a bit easier to patrol. And of course, just getting to the planet itself was particularly hazardous.
The Acades Maelstrom.
A series of navigation beacons were required to guide ships through the storm, which was a torrent of true horrors.
Carbon bergs, size of planets crashing into each other. It's ionized gas, water vapor, possibly vacuum-breathing life forms swirling around the moor. Only way in or out is this channel.
Constant friction lightning events, billions of carbon bergs and ice chunks, and most terrifyingly, the enormous Summa Verminoth. This tentacled beast descended on any ship that tried to take a shortcut through the Maelstrom, and just added to the mystery and lore surrounding the drug capital. If you did safely make it to planetside, you were met with two strikingly different hemispheres. The south was home to lush rainforests as far as the eye could see, providing excellent views, wildlife, and a mild climate. But nearly the entire northern hemisphere was devoted to mining spice, coaxium, Kesseline, and the Kessel Stones. The Yoruba royal family is likely human, as most of the staff and guards are human, but their major domo Kanash Locke was a Twi'lek. Not much is known about the Yorubas, but they certainly were willing to sacrifice this world to earn as much credits as possible. It's unclear how long this royal family inhabited Kessel. There really aren't any ancient accounts of human settlers or anything like that, but ruling what provided nearly all of the galaxy's spice must have made them incredibly powerful. The Pikes seem to have exclusive rights to the sale of this raw spice, but we see for employment they also use the Zygerians. We see the Dockmaster as a Zygerian, whose people are notorious for running one of the longest operating, largest, and particularly cruel slave empires, and who were opposed by the Jedi since the time of the Old Republic. If we go down into one of these mines, we see just how many were subject to these horrible conditions.
Those are not droids. They're people.
These slaves were of all sorts of species, and even what looks like a child right here. In the back there are some notable giant spider mining droids, And they had the loader droids that actually pack on the big crates of unrefined spice into ships. Though this flat plate on their back seems like it could fold down and work like the organic slaves, carrying these bucket-sized loads on their back. And then we also see these large platforms for bringing up massive equipment and enormous hauls of spice. But most of the transporting of this spice is in these buckets, that we see on the backs of slaves and being brought up these intimidating steps. It's hard to tell, but it seems to be around 500 feet tall, something like a 50-story building or 200 steps. And honestly, I think that's underestimating it. During the Imperial era, it seems like the spread of these mining sites increased, as the surface becomes even more noxious. When you break Kessel stone to extract the spice, there are pockets of poisonous gas that are released into the atmosphere, sometimes just enough to make you woozy, but presumably if there was too much, it could kill some of these organic slaves. And then there was also the refinement of Kesseline. From that same stone, you could either go the powder drug route or the liquid fuel route, all depending on how you refined it. Kesseline had this bright green appearance, and was refined in these large open-air pools. This was said to leak into the aquifer, which combined with the noxious air being released, made many feel that Kessel was far beyond ever reverting back to the lush rainforest it once was. This larger circular site we see in 19 BBY is very similar, if not the same place visited by the Spectres in 5 BBY. Called Spice Mine K-76, by 5 BBY it was mostly worked by Wookiees, and this is actually something we see develop over the decades, as the slave population becomes more specialized over the years. Having few, if any, Wookiees in the beginning, a ton of Dwoonie, Gigaron, humans, and Twi'leks, to mostly Wookiee but still some other species by 10 BBY when Solo and company paid a visit, then almost exclusively Wookiee in 5 BBY. This is because right after the Clone Wars, the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk was taken over by the Imps, and the Empire tried to capture the entire race for slave labor. They had a long history of Jedi alliance and independence, and of course their natural physical ability was a threat to the Empire. So by turning them into slaves, they killed two birds with one Kessel stone. Instead of becoming really powerful rebel allies, they were now really powerful slave workers. But I can't miss this opportunity to quickly tell you the story of this guy, a human slave, Tak. He was a con man from Coruscant, and he actually tried to rob Princess Yoruba when she was visiting the capital. He was captured, he received Kessel-style justice, and was thrown into the mines. We don't know much about this slave process, but the droid L3 gives us some very vague and ominous details.
Director Tolside said our slaves should follow those guys to get clipped and tagged.
What are they clipping?
And there are these dedicated slave inspectors who look for physical signs of strength or weakness. With this Pike Run mine, we see that it's cut differently, more squared than the large circle of 76. It does seem like the Pikes are in full control of this mine. And so I wouldn't put it past Maul's Crimson Dawn to just take out King Yoruba, literally cutting out the middleman. When the Empire rose, they likely would have let the criminals stay in control of this infamous world, while still keeping a close eye on it. Much like they did with the Hutts, keeping the criminals in direct control of the underworld, but making sure the crime bosses knew that their reign was only on the permission of the Emperor. And because of so many natural restrictions to this world, those narrow passes made it very easy to blockade all of the exits from Kessel. With this station, we see how so many were kept in the control by so few. This one center could control the mine via a wide array of droids, ubiquitous surveillance equipment, and guards stationed throughout with disabling stun weapons. The droids too were kept in their own form of slavery via restraining bolts. When these were removed and the droids received some motivation from L3, all Kessel broke loose. A side note here is that the mines of Kessel were so universally feared that the word became synonymous with hell, with phrases like I just used, and equivalent to damned being Kesseled. For instance, you would say the voyage was Kesseled from the start. And we even get a hint at some of this with C-3PO.
What are we going to do? We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel or smashed into who knows what.
So even the fate of droids on Kessel sent chills down the circuits of droids everywhere. Now there are some other very interesting details from this particular mine. We see that one of the rarest fuels in the galaxy, coaxium, is also mined here. This hyperfuel could be used to line hyperdrives and actually initiate that interdimensional transition. Or if it was used as regular fuel, it was so potent that a tiny amount could fuel whole fleets, and a single drop could output enormous power via a ship's standard engines. This was kept behind a large vault and worth an incredible amount of credits. We also see some of the defenses there, many guns ranging from the power output of an E-Web to something similar to the P-towers we saw on Hoth, all encircling the opening of the mine. And we saw that when Kira threw those explosives, it set off a chain reaction, either igniting some of the Kesseline, the Tabana gas reserves for those weapons, or both. And also, if you look close, everything is coated in this yellowish powder, produced in the mining of the Kessel Stone, and it coats everything from the equipment to the people. Just about everything has this yellow layer on it. And it's important to remember that this place was not only hell for the slaves that work there, but also the countless beings across the galaxy that became addicted to these drugs, suffering in their own personal hells. With the lower levels of Coruscant being the Pike's main spice market, their customers withered away and lost their minds, bringing this hell off of Kessel and into themselves, their families, and their communities. So that's it for the breakdown and history of Kessel, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Spice having medical benefits is a funny backstory. Author Kevin J. Anderson of Jedi Search, released in 1994, said that there was pressure from what he described as politically correct individuals at Lucasfilm that didn't like that spice being a drug made Han Solo a drug smuggler. But Lucas confirmed, spice is a drug. So to find a middle, he wrote in that there were some medicinal uses as well. He didn't mention this, but it also would make it so that Uncle Owen told Luke that his dad was a navigator of a drug freighter. And of course, spice is a reference to the novel Dune, which a lot of things, even sand crawlers, were taken from by name. In the novel, spice is also a drug, dangerous to mine, but also has some really important and positive uses as well. That con man Tak is played by Anthony Daniels, or C-3PO, and was a reference to the droid's fears in A New Hope. In the original script, then called Journey of the Wills Part 1, it's actually spelled Kissel, K-I-S-S-E-L, and a certain Grand, with an E at the end, Moff Tarkin, led the Kesselian Dragoons. And the Kessel Run, the name of the route that we see Solo and team take through the Maelstrom, wasn't the only way to get to Kessel. It was the quickest, and pilots would boast about who could make it through the run the fastest, as this was a good thing to have on your spice running resume. But there was also the Pavos Leon, a more traditional hyperspace route through this sector, and the Sanity Skip, a more secretive route used by pirates and some smugglers, which takes you from Kessel out to Oseon. And remember, we'll do a whole separate Legends version of this video, as almost all of this information is wildly different and really interesting. While additional information in canon comes from the books Ultimate Star Wars, Solo Visual Dictionary, Smuggler's Run, The Galactic Explorer's Guide, and the Galactic Atlas. But most important of all, remember, he who controls the spice controls the universe. Unless he's Maul in charge of Crimson Dawn, in which case he's just a great tragic character. And the Force will be with you. Always.